What odds would I have to offer you to risk your life if the reward for success was everything you could possibly want? Generational wealth, a large family, land, position, you name it. And your life goes from desperately chasing that endangered animal that is the American dream to becoming part of the ruling class in this country or some other country, take your pick. If the odds were strong, I'm sure many of you, especially you guys without kids, might take it. Because hey, why not? But what if the odds are only a little better than a coin flip? It makes you think. Because do you let that chance go? Maybe. But with things being how they are these days, maybe not. And I ask this because, as ridiculous as it sounds, this question is the absolute best way for you to do a Star Trek, Spock, Vulcan mind meld with a German in one of these migrating tribal armies in 401 AD, which is where we left off last time. Because, for reasons that we'll get into, the German tribes on the Roman frontier also had reasons to look negatively at their future prospects in Germania. And like my hypothetical here, they too had a high-risk choice to make, because across the Roman frontier were lands rich beyond their wildest dreams. Sure, you might die tangoing with the Legion, but hey, if your team wins and you survive, the world is your oyster. You want land, a large family, wealth, an awesome lifestyle, time, the most truly valuable thing, all the luxuries you can dream of, they're yours. In the words of the great rapper/philosopher of our time, Lil' Kim, you get the power, the money, and the respect. You get everything you can dream of, basically. You just have to put your neck on the line to make it happen. And I do this, I try and put you in the headspace of these people real quick before we begin, because what you're going to hear today kind of has to be a high-level, big arrows on map story done at 30,000 feet. Because there's no other way to tell the story of the German conquest of the greatest empire in Western history, which is our angle here, the German conquest itself of the Western Roman Empire, with a big focus on the medieval world that will begin growing out of its ashes. And so, while the topic we're about to get into is awesome, I don't want to lose sight of the human element, of what it was like to be on the ground, in the trenches, so to say. Because it's so easy for stories like this to become just an abstraction in our minds, where the story becomes about the thing you call the Roman Empire rather than about the people that the story is about. Because like all stories, at the end of the day, this is a story about people, some of whom were having their wildest dreams come true, while others were slowly entering into a nightmare. Because while the Germans that will survive what we're about to get into will get the money and the power and the respect and start a whole new civilizational era in Europe, for the Romans that will be part of this story, the world they knew, that they grew up in, would come apart at the seams. Before we begin, though, if you're new here, I highly encourage you to start off with the last episode at least, called Völkerwanderung Part 1, because it will make everything you're about to listen to here a lot better and more worthwhile. But if you're the kind of person that likes to dive right into the thick of it, by all means. Just know that all the dominoes we're going to flick over in this episode will make a lot more sense if you start with Part 1. Plus, you can find out why we're talking about the German conquest of the Western Roman Empire on a Viking Age history podcast. But again, dealer's choice. Either way, we're going to start off right where we left off last time, with the Visigoths, because they, more than any other group, bear the most responsibility for tearing apart the Western Empire. And last time we left off, we ended with the Visigoths leaving the lands the Eastern Empire had given them in northwestern Greece to make a play for Italy, which was the jewel and beating heart of the Western Empire, with this invasion beginning in 401 AD. And luckily for us, the greatest poet in the Western Empire at the time, a man named Claudian Claudianus, wrote a poem that has survived the past 1600 years, in which he puts a speech in the mouth of Alaric, if you remember, the king of the Visigoths, during this invasion in 401 AD. Now, big disclaimer, this speech isn't real. Alaric never spoke the words that you're about to hear, but Because it is a poem about this invasion that was made for the West Roman court immediately after the event, and because we have very little that we can attribute to the Germans themselves, this gets us as close as we can to getting a flavor of the times, even though it's, we're going to hear it through the filter of full-on Roman propaganda, in the sense that this poem paints Alaric with all the good barbarian tropes that Rome reserved for the Germans. But because this poem is epic and dramatic, and it'll get everyone's blood pumping, while also putting us right back in the story where we left off last time, it makes it a great thing to tee off with, so I'm going to read it. So with those caveats, here are the words that this greatest poet in the Western Empire, this Claudian Claudianus, put in the mouth of Alaric, who, in the poem, is angrily responding to someone who told him that invading Italy was a bad idea. You can probably see where this is going. I quote, "Am I, who have routed so many emperors, to endure flight at thine advice? I, whom all nature obeys? Have I not seen the mountains leveled at my feet, the rivers dried up? Never may my country's gods, the spirits of my forefathers, allow that I retrace my footsteps on a backward path. This land shall be mine whether I hold it in fee as conqueror or in death as conquered. I have overrun so many peoples and cities. I have burst through the Alps and drunk the waters of the Eridanus from a victor's helm." That's a river in northern Italy. I continue. "What is left for me but Rome? My nation was strong even when it had no allied arms to help it. But now that I hold sway over Illyria, now that its people have made me their leader, I have forced the Thracians to forge me spears, swords, and helmets with the sweat of their brows, in Roman towns, whose rightful overlord I now am, to contribute iron for mine own uses. Thus is fate on my side. Rome, whose territories I have laid waste year by year, has become my slave. 'Tis she who has supplied me with arms. Her own metal has glowed in the furnace, artfully molten and fashioned for her own undoing by reluctant smiths. The gods, too, urge me on. Not for me are dreams or birds, but the clear cry uttered openly from the sacred grove." A cry from a sacred grove that, according to him, said, "Away with delay, Alaric. Boldly cross the Italian Alps this year, and thou shalt reach the city. Thus far the path is mine. Who so cowardly as to dally after this encouragement, or to hesitate to obey the call of heaven?" So he spoke and made ready his army to take the road, exhorting them to combat. End quote. Alaric crossed the Italian Alps in the year of 401 AD, timing his crossing so that when the Western legions manning the Rhine frontier north of the Alps got word of his move, the winter snows had already sealed off the mountain passes, enabling Alaric and his Visigoths to raid northern Italy with impunity and briefly besiege the Western emperor, who was named Honorius. And that's a name to put to memory, by the way. He looms large in this story. But when the mountain passes melted enough a few months later and became viable in March of 402, the Western Emperor's lead general, a half-Roman, half-German with the awesome name Stilicho, another name to remember, by the way, marched through with a large Roman army that, and this is key, was likely beefed up with some legions that he had pulled off the Rhine defensive line that we spoke about in the last episode. Again, lots of requests here. But this is another thing to keep in mind for everything they were about to get into, that by pulling legions off the Rhine to fight Alaric and rescue the emperor and defend the imperial core in Italy, this West Roman general Stilicho may have been, there's debate on this, kind of borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, so to say. Basically weakening one area a bit to protect a more important area, kind of like how the human body responds to hypothermia by pulling blood out of the extremities into the core. And if Stilicho did this, which again most historians I read believe he did, this likely weakened the Rhine defensive line. And I emphasize this because this movement of troops south to defend Italy usually figures prominently in the story we're about to get into. So again, it's something to keep in the back of your mind, that the empire was pulling blood, literally, from the extremities to protect the imperial core in Italy. And after crossing the Alps with this beefed-up Roman army, Stilicho defeated Alaric and his Visigoths at the battles of Pollentia and then at Verona in 402, which brought Alaric and the Visigoths' attempt for Italy to an end. But the key thing here is that Alaric's defeat wasn't total, and Stilicho, after negotiations, allowed Alaric and his Visigoths to settle in Illyricum, an area north of the Adriatic where modern-day Croatia and Bosnia are today, with their army intact to serve as treaty allies to the West Romans. And while the Visigoths sat there licking their wounds, things began to happen all around them that strengthened their position. And heads up, what we're about to get into here is going to be a bit chaotic. It's going to be like one of those movies where a bomb suddenly goes off and, the main character is thrown to the ground and his ears are ringing and he's trying to stand up and start moving. One moment you're fine, everything's normal, we just beat a major German incursion and sent them running, everything's all good, then boom, you're on the ground and you can't hear and you can't see and everything's on fire. And while the things we're about to get into happened basically simultaneously, hence the bomb analogy, we have to take them one at a time. So we're going to start with what happened north of the Alps. Because a few years after Alaric's defeat, the Huns began expanding westward into Central Europe, starting in 405 AD. Now, quick reminder / refresher, because we haven't talked about the Huns in a while. Remember, it was the Huns who teed all this off. They came out of the steppe, they ran into the Alans, and then the Goths, and like a bunch of dominoes, they pushed some of the Goths into the Eastern Empire and started all the violence that we talked about in the last episode between what would become the Visigoths and the East Romans. Now, during all that violence, all the fighting between Alaric and the East Romans where they're trying to hash out a deal, during all that time, those Huns had created a small kingdom on the north bank of the Danube by subjugating the German tribes in that area. And a few years after this, during all that fighting between the Visigoths and the East Romans, it is believed that by 405, that Hunnic presence had grown stronger because more Huns are believed to have migrated out of the steppe to join them. And so the point here is that when this beefed-up Hunnic force, which remember, fought as horse archers with strong compound bows that the Germans just didn't really have a good answer to, when that Hunnic force began moving westward towards the core of the Germanic world in Central Europe in force, it freaked out two large German tribes called the Vandals and the Sueves, as well as a non-Germanic tribe of Alans who were all in the Hunnic warpath. Because by this time, these tribes knew exactly what they were in for. They knew exactly how brutal Hunnic subjugation was. They knew what Hunnic subjugation entailed. And so again, they freaked out. And in the winter of 406, but maybe 405, there's some debate on this, these Vandals, Alans, and Sueves said to heck with this, then joined up together for security and crossed the Rhine when it was frozen during the middle of winter. Which is why historians call this group of tribes the, quote, Rhine invaders. And because the great Roman electric fence along the Rhine that kept the Germanic velociraptor at bay had likely been weakened by Stilicho earlier, if you remember he pulled those legions off the Rhine in order to fight Alaric in Italy. That's why we emphasize that so much. These tribes were able to enter right into Roman territory without being seriously contested. Now, quick call out about these Rhine invaders. There are historians like Walter Goffart, for example, that believe these tribes' move across the Rhine was more inspired by the Visigoth success than anything. That their move across the river was motivated by a kind of, hey, we can do that too mentality. Either way, The moment this information that these Vandals, Alans, and Sueves had crossed the Rhine, the moment that information reached the legions in England, they panicked, because they were justifiably concerned that the emperor was not looking out for the north, and so they revolted. And after some intrigue relating to who was going to lead this revolt, they eventually made a regular soldier who would be called Constantine III, emperor, who then took the legions south across the channel in 407 so they could confront these Rhine invaders directly. And after crossing, again in 407, the legions in Gaul and Spain immediately defected to join the rebellion. And folks, just to call out, this is why we spent so much time talking about the frontier in the last episode. Because look what happens the moment the Germans cross the Rhine in force. Almost everything, literally everything, north and west of the Alps rebels. Why? Because they knew what the Germanic velociraptor getting across the electric fence meant. And so, take a step back here for a moment and zoom up into space. In 404 AD, before this bomb went off, in 404 AD, the Empire looks great. Stilicho just defeated Alaric. Everything on the, at least from the perspective of like a map of the Roman Empire, everything looks okay. And then 2 years later, Gaul, England, and Spain are in revolt, and a major force of Vandals, Alans, and Sueves have crossed the Rhine and made Gaul into a war zone. And there's a poem from a Roman poet, a Christian Roman poet, by the way, named Arrentius, who witnessed what happened next. And I want to read this because remember, when we do these big 30,000-foot flybys of huge events, it's just so easy to forget the human reality on the ground. And here is how this Arrentius poet described what it was like to be on the ground in Gaul at this time. Neither the rugged heights of dense forests, nor mountains, nor rivers strong with rushing whirlpools, nor castles in their positions, nor cities safe behind walls, nor paths inaccessible by sea, nor desolate deserts, nor hollows, nor even caves under fearful cliffs could prevail to evade the barbaric hordes. To many, false pledges, to many, perjuries, to many, civic betrayal was the cause of death. Ambush accomplished much, open violence much. What was not overcome by force was subdued by famine. The wretched mother fell along with her child and husband. The master, with his servants, submitted to servitude. Here they lay as food for dogs. Burning houses, which snatched away many a life, served as pyres. Throughout villages, estates, fields, crossroads, and all districts, along every road from here to there, death, grief, ruin, slaughter, fires, lamentation, all Gaul smoked as a single funeral pyre. End quote. These people were just like you and I. They had wives and girlfriends. They had children, parents, brothers and sisters. They had hopes and dreams. But if they were unfortunate enough to find themselves in the path of these Germans, they had a big chance of being added to Arrentius's Gallic funeral pyre. But like we spoke about earlier, there's two sides to every coin. And the Germans engaged in this looting were seizing life-changing wealth during this process, as they rode from villa to villa and town to town, never knowing what they were going to find. Maybe an empty villa, but maybe one filled with gold, silver, and other valuables. The ancient equivalent of ripping packs of Pokemon cards and hoping for that holographic Charizard, if I can make light of it. So, this is one of those best of times, worst of times Charles Dickens things, depending on who you were. And when infighting occurred within this Constantine III's rebel regime, remember, England, Gaul, and Spain rebelled with him. When infighting occurred within his regime, it enabled these Vandal, Alan, and Sueve Rhine invaders to retreat westward and enter Spain in 409. And within 2 years, by 411, they had taken it over entirely. And keep in mind, This is just what was happening north and west of the Alps. We haven't even gotten into Italy yet because Italy wasn't spared this chaos either. And to pivot our gaze south here, in 405, so again, remember, there's a bomb, the bomb analogy, right? All this is happening at once. In 405, probably the same year those Rhine invaders came across the Rhine in the first place, a force of Germans, mostly Goths, but to be very clear, this is not Alaric and his Visigoths. They're still hanging out in Illyricum, north of the Adriatic. But a force of Goths, likely 20,000 strong, or maybe even a bit stronger than that, slipped over the Danube with their families in tow, and then hopped the Alps and invaded Italy. And this second big German play for Italy was led by a guy named Radagaisus. And after a period of raiding and warfare in northern Italy in 405 and 406, remember, at the same time as those Rhine invaders are crossing the Rhine and making Gaul into a funeral pyre, Stilicho crushed Radagaisus big time. And unlike Alaric, who even in defeat managed to escape Stilicho's net, Radagaisus's Germans were executed in their thousands after the battle. And so many were enslaved that the slave market in Italy temporarily collapsed. And this is something to pay attention to. Just think about that for a moment. That so many slaves are put on sale after Stilicho defeated this Radagaisus guy that the value of a slave at auction hit zero because it was more costly to feed them than they were worth. It's just mind-blowing to imagine that the marginal value of human labor, what you'd be willing to pay for a slave, could hit zero temporarily in a rich, developed agricultural economy like Italy. So that gives you a sense of the scale of things. And this victory that we're talking about here, of Stilicho defeating his second major German incursion, was a huge deal for the West Romans. Because not only did he defeat a German incursion, but it meant that Stilicho was able to press 12,000 of Radagaisus's surviving Germans, most of whom were Goths of various kinds, into Roman service in the legion. Something that, if you remember from the last episode when we talked about the decline in the Roman people's martial virtue, was a big deal. Because, remember, finding men to fight was a struggle in both the East and Western empires at this time. And so, with Gaul, England, and Spain in revolt, being able to press 12,000 Germans into the legion was a godsend. Now, if you hear this and you find yourself wondering, how could Stilicho and the West Roman Emperor Honorius trust these guys who were just fighting the legion like the day before? The short answer is that they couldn't. Obviously not fully. And so to make sure these warriors behaved and did as they were told, Stilicho took their wives and children and distributed them throughout different Italian cities as hostages. And look, if you're a German at this time whose tribe chose to roll the dice and cross the frontier, this is the real nightmare. Because once your wives and children are taken as hostages and distributed throughout different cities that, keep in mind, have walls and garrisons and gates, and therefore can't all be taken at once, it means there's basically no way out of that situation. Because think about it. No rebellion, however brilliantly you plan it, is going to be able to rescue everyone's wives and children at once, which means that rebellion kind of becomes impossible. Because if you can't rescue everyone's families at once, men in your hypothetical rebellion against the legion, whose families are stored in cities that can't be immediately seized, have every reason under the sun to betray you in order to protect their families. Because, if they don't and the rebellion starts and their families can't be rescued immediately, those families will be killed. And this means that these Germans that had been pressed into service had very, very few options available to them. But 2 years after this, in 408, remember, by this same time, Gaul, England, and Spain are now in revolt, and those Rhine invaders are making all of Gaul into a funeral pyre. Fate intervened in the form of paranoia in the court of the Western Empire, specifically in the mind of the Western Emperor Honorius himself. Because in 408, Remember, 2 years after defeating Radagaisus and pressing those 12,000 men into service 2 years after that, an anti-German faction that really didn't like Stilicho gained influence with Honorius and began whispering their fears and anxieties into his ear. That Stilicho couldn't be trusted and that he was plotting rebellion to potentially try and put his own son on the Western throne. And the driving force behind this shift in the Western court to distrusting the guy that had just defeated his second major German army in 5 years is a little complicated. There's 3 basic reasons, right? First, members of the court were angry and suspicious as to why Stilicho hadn't dealt with the revolt of Gaul, England, and Spain, which, as you know, had been going on for a few years now. Basically, hey, Stilicho, why haven't you marched north and dealt with that? And second, these members of the court that are whispering in Honorius' ear, really didn't like how nicely Stilicho had been treating Alaric. This requires a little bit of context because it's kind of an out-of-the-blue thing, I know. But remember, Stilicho was half Vandal, meaning half German. And while the histories that have come down to us imply that he was very culturally Roman, him and Alaric knew each other pretty well. They had fought together many years earlier when they were young, because they had both fought in the Eastern Army together. And then they had fought against each other, if you remember in the last episode, when Alaric and his Visigoths had rebelled and launched that great raid into Greece that we spoke of. And so Stilicho and Alaric knew each other. And one theory right now, this is a theory, is that Stilicho may have seen Alaric and his Visigoths as potential tools to help him retake Gaul for the Western Empire, or perhaps even make a play for the Eastern Empire as well to try and reunify the whole thing. With the thinking here being that because Alaric was a potential ally in these pursuits, that there was an open line of communication between the two men. And this makes sense, because, why not? Maybe I cut Alaric a good deal with some land and good freedoms, and I make friends with him so he doesn't think we're going to go back on the deal like the Eastern Empire did with him and his Visigoths before. And hey, if we're partners and we have some trust, well, we can combine and create a massive force that can retake Gaul and maybe even reunify the whole Roman Empire. You take that deal, I'll take that deal. That's a real good deal. But the problem was that when Alaric threatened to invade Italy in 408, remember, 2 years after Radagaisus was defeated, he threatened to invade Italy unless the Western Empire paid him 4,000 pounds of gold. And because Stilicho pushed the Senate to agree to this demand, the Western Empire paid up. And look, this is all good and fine if you trust Stilicho and trust the plan. You're a Stilicho plan truster, and you trust that Stilicho's plan is going to be the best thing for the Western Empire. All of this is fine. But if you're Honorius and you have anti-German members in your court whispering things like, hey, why hasn't Stilicho invaded Gaul? And hey, what if that gold that Stilicho just convinced you to give Alaric made Alaric loyal to Stilicho? And what if they're partnering together to attack you and put his son on the throne? If you're not a Stilicho plan truster, well, you can see how this puts all of Stilicho's actions in a new light, right? And again, while it might sound crazy that the emperor began to distrust the guy who just kept defeating German army after German army for you, you have to keep in mind that Honorius in the Western court, these whisperers in the Western court, were surrounded by Germans. There were Germans in the legion, even before those 12,000 from Radagaisus' defeated army were pressed in. And then you have Alaric and his Visigoth Germans lurking north of the Adriatic, shaking everyone down. And there were many tens of thousands of Goths who, remember, had been enslaved to work Italian farms for the Roman aristocracy. And so there were Germans everywhere. These court members turn in any direction, and there's big, blue-eyed, blonde-haired Germans looking back at them. And this, in the backdrop of Stilicho convincing the West Romans to pay Alaric that 4,000 pounds of gold, combined with him not making moves to deal with the rebellion north of the Alps, proved to be too much. And so, with a head full of paranoia, but remember, it's not paranoia if they really are out to get you, Honorius summoned Rustilico to Ravenna, which, if you don't know, is a highly defensible city on the Italian Adriatic coast, about 70 miles south of Venice, where the West Roman court had moved a few years previously, and executed him. And then in another bout of paranoia, or again because maybe there was a plan, we obviously don't know, Honorius ordered the killing of all the Germans who were serving in the legion, as well as the killing of those 12,000 German warriors who had been pressed in, the killing of their wives and children, who, remember, were stashed throughout Italy, in order to get ahead of what he believed was an imminent German uprising in Italy against him. Now, as you can tell, I find this part of the story so interesting, because not only was it a huge deal, but it's the ultimate historical topic for what-ifs. Because what if Honorius was right? Most historians believe he wasn't, and that this was literally the dumbest move of all time, but put yourself in his shoes. What would you do if you truly believed there was a German uprising imminent throughout Italy? Striking first may have been the logical response. You and I may have made the same decision. You don't know. But we get into this. We tell this story that obviously I find entertaining, and it seems like a side story, but it's not. Because after this anti-German pogrom that Honorius launched in Italy, Alaric's army, which was still in Illyricum, became flooded with recruits in the form of survivors who had fled north to join him. Many of whom, and this is key, had just lost wives and children to Roman betrayal. And this is important because the Germans took revenge extremely seriously. Way more seriously than we do today. Because, and again, this is heavy detail, but it matters, German societies had a practice of blood feuds, where an aggrieved party was expected to seek revenge. That revenge was the honorable thing to do. That, as a man, you had to get revenge, not only to save face, but to protect your family and kinsmen. Because, context, these tribes didn't have police forces like we have today. Instead, peace was kind of assured by mutually assured destruction within the tribe, where if you screwed with someone, or their people, their kinsmen and friends would screw you back in the same way or worse. And so if you misbehaved and you did something bad, it could directly lead to the deaths of your own family members. That's how it worked. And this means that what you are looking at here, in the form of these German survivors that had fled north to Alaric, were probably like the human equivalent of a ballistic missile that was on its way. Where it wasn't a question of if they were going to seek revenge, but a question of when. And you keep that in the back of your mind, and you remember the way that we described these people like to fight in the last episode. If you remember that extremely direct, sledgehammer-like style of fighting, and you tell me what you think that looks like on the battlefield. When you have a people that already are known for being extraordinarily brave and fighting in an extremely violent and direct way, who have a practice of societal revenge, and now many of them had their wives and children killed and are going to seek revenge. You tell me what that transforms someone into in the battlefield. Alaric immediately invaded in 408. He didn't waste this gift that had fallen into his lap. And so he invaded in 408, the same year that this pogrom went down, with a now beefed up army of 30,000 men or more, depending on who you read, which, remember from the last episode, was a huge army by German standards. Before he reached Rome, a senator tried to beg mercy for the city and its people by appealing to Alaric's humanity. And if we believe the record that has come down to us, not all academics believe it, by the way, but I'll tell you because it's amusing regardless. Alaric is said to have responded by saying, "The thicker the hay, the easier it's mowed." Basically, when I'm killing, the more the merrier. And so he marched directly to Rome, put it under siege, and starved it. And to save themselves from what may have been a level of grief-fueled revenge you can only imagine, the city, according to one source, paid Alaric's army 5,000 pounds of gold, 30,000 pounds of silver, 4,000 silk tunics, and 3,000 leather hides dyed red, which I guess had some value, big swag moment, I guess, for the Goths, as well as 3,000 pounds of pepper, which, for those that don't know, was valuable. Spices are always valuable no matter when and where you are in history. And they were also forced to free 40,000 Gothic slaves, many of whom walked right into Alaric's army, after which he withdrew this enriched and beefed up army to Tuscany, which is a very beautiful region just north of Rome. The West Romans then tried to convince the Emperor Honorius to sign a deal with Alaric to achieve a permanent peace, which, just so you know, is also what Alaric wanted, by the way. And this is like a very important thing to call out, that, folks, this is not some grand plan to destroy the Western Empire. I mean, would they like to take over the entire Western Empire? Sure. But all of this maneuvering is still politics. The goal here is still the exact same thing that we talked about last time. Alaric's goal is still to carve out a really, really good deal within the Roman system. Because why break something that works? This is a wonderful system. We just want a really cushy deal within this system, right? That's the goal. But the problem is that when talks began, Alaric made the mistake of asking for way too much. He straight highballed right out the gate in the worst way. Because he not only asked for land that, in modern terms, stretched from where modern-day Venice is up to modern-day Austria, then south to the Adriatic. It's a big area, but the important thing is that the fact that that area extends all the way to Venice meant that part of his area would have been within the protective barrier of the Alps, which meant that he could breathe down the neck of the Western Court whenever he wanted to. So he asked for some land that was within the Alps, and he also asked for grain shipments, to keep his people well fed, and annual payments in gold as well, while also asking for Stilicho's old title, something that would have cemented the deal by giving the Visigoths, more legit legal standing in the Roman system. Basically the land and the grain and the gold, this deal gets a lot more legitimate if Alaric has a high title. And Stilicho's title of Magister Militae, if I'm pronouncing that right, also would have given him control over the Western Empire's armies, which, in combination with Alaric having his own power base in the form of the Visigoths, would have basically made him de facto ruler in the West. And so, Alaric highballed straight out the gate at this negotiation in the purest sense of the term. And this huge ask infuriated Honorius so much that even when Alaric watered down his ask to just the land north of the Alps, no more land around Venice, and just the grain shipments, no gold, no fancy title, the negotiations still failed, prompting Honorius to scrape together a Roman army and throw it at Alaric, who destroyed it, after which the Visigoths marched directly to Rome and put it under siege for a second time. And it's at this point in the story that Honorius panicked and almost left Italy for the Eastern Empire by ship, but supposedly at the last moment before he left, the Eastern Emperor sent 4,000 men to guard him in Ravenna, and so he stayed. And after a super interesting bout of diplomacy and betrayal and attempts at deal-making, which, if you're into what I'm talking about here, if you find this topic really interesting, you should 100% look up. I'll upload it. It'll be in the image thread. I'll throw a link up for you to read. But after a bout of diplomacy and betrayal and deal-making, the Visigoths entered Rome's Salarian Gate, famously on August 24th in 410. According to one source, after slaves opened the gate from them from within. And they entered into again on August 24th of 410, they entered into a city that still probably had somewhere between 500,000 to maybe close to 1,000,000 people at this time. A city that had once ruled from Hadrian's Wall in northern England to modern-day Iraq, and they pillaged it for 3 days. With the only thin silver lining for the city's inhabitants being that because the Visigoths were Christian now, something we'll talk about later, when the city was sacked, it wasn't massacred. And, subtle distinction, but these distinctions matter. There's a whole, scale of how bad a city sacking is. And this was lighter on that scale, supposedly. Because the Visigoths, as Christians, set aside major churches within the city as sanctuaries. And so these churches were places of refuge for the few Romans that could squeeze inside of them. This event was a thunderbolt to the spine of every single person across the Roman world. And I thought about having Graham read out some quotes in Latin that have come down to us from the time, but there's nothing in there that would surprise you. It's exactly what you can expect from a people feeling absolutely floored that a city that had once ruled their known world, a city that called itself the Eternal City, had been sacked by illiterate Germans. And while the Western Empire wasn't done yet, it was in the fires of Rome and the sacking of the Western imperial core that the seeds of the medieval period were planted. And there's a few lines from a book by the famous 19th century historian Hans Delbrück that does a wonderful job at visualizing this transition into a medieval world. It comes from his History of the Art of War, Volume 2, and so I'm going to read a section of it here. I quote, "There was no longer any question of the effective border defense that had guarded the empire for so long. The Germans stormed across the Rhine and Danube, sailed on their ships from the Black Sea all the way across the Mediterranean and into the Atlantic, and nowhere was it possible to defend against their plundering raids. Unmercifully, they slaughtered those inhabitants whom they did not carry off into slavery. Even today, more than 60 French cities show traces of their having been burned down in that time period, and how, after being destroyed, the cities were built up again, tightly pressed together and surrounded by walls. In the preceding peaceful centuries, the cities were open and were often widely spread out. But now they were built with narrow streets and as small a circumference as possible in order to be able to defend themselves better. In the thick towers and walls that were now built and have survived for thousands of years until broken down again by the pickaxe of modern traffic or archaeological diggings, the remains of columns, statues, and beams have been found, often bearing inscriptions that identify the period of their construction and still showing traces of the fires set by the barbarians. Far beyond the gates of these fortified cities, however, are to be found remains of destroyed temples and amphitheaters that allow us to guess at the extent of the formerly open cities. More numerous in its population and richer in all the resources of civilization than at the time of Caesar Augustus, the Roman Empire had become too weak to defend its civilization, since it had lost its own standing army, its well-disciplined legions." End quote. If burned rubble from Roman columns and statues being used to build high walls around now small, heavily fortified cities isn't the perfect visual of the violent birth of the medieval world, I don't know what is. And while I love classical civilization with its logic and discipline and reason and stoicism and even temperance and organization as much as the next guy, in as much as we can broad brush a whole civilization, I personally love what comes next a lot more. But to quote the filmmaker Werner Herzog, I love it against my better judgment. This is one of those my mind is telling me no, but my body is telling me yes kind of things, if you'll pardon the R. Kelly reference. Because if you're like me, you might appreciate the medieval world for the same reasons that I do, like its proud hierarchy and its anti-humanistic simplicity, and its emphasis on force of personality and individualism, or the strength, energy, confidence, even virility of its aristocratic class, with their knights and castles that, while they obviously lacked the intellectual depth of the classical world, they were all more permeated by a sense of the mysterious and the sacred. And so to me, it all just feels way more grounded and organic and human and tethered to the earth, And while this medieval world was coming in fast, it wasn't here yet. Because even though this seems like pure cataclysm, the Roman Empire's over, the Western Empire's fight wasn't fully done. Because, if you recall, the Emperor Honorius was still holed up in Ravenna, which was very defensible because, for those of you who don't know, Ravenna is surrounded by marshlands and lagoons, and more importantly, the Western Empire still drew tax revenue from the Mediterranean islands in North Africa. And while Alaric may have ended it all right then and there, had he been successful in moving the Visigoths to North Africa, which he tried to do because the region was the breadbasket and basically the main source of taxes for the Western Empire by this time, something we'll talk about in a few moments, the ships that he had hired were wrecked in a storm, and then Alaric died from disease in southern Italy. After which, his brother led the Visigoths north, then across the Alps into southern Gaul, and after a few years of scorched earth fighting that saw everyone suffer, the Romans and the Visigoths, the Romans and the Visigoths eventually hammered out a deal in 418 AD. So again, that's 8 years after Rome was initially sacked. We're talking about a decent chunk of time here. And because we've talked about these deals in the past, quick note here, this was an actually good deal because it granted the Visigoths rich and productive land in Aquitaine, basically modern-day southwestern France, in return for them to become subordinate treaty allies of Rome, where they'd still fight for Rome, but they would do so under their own leaders. So, if you remember from the last episode, no one's going to get cannon fodder this time. And most historians I read consider this to be a good deal because it was stable, and it enabled Rome to retake most of Gaul, something I've uploaded a map of, see image 1 under the post for this episode, episode 4, in the highlights section of my Twitter profile. Remember, my Twitter profile is called the Northway Pod. And for those that are new here, this show has a lot of follow along as you go image uploads, and I highly encourage you to check it out. Definitely enriches the story. So again, highlights section of my Twitter profile, post with this episode, image 1. It's in a thread underneath that post. Now, before you Rome fans out there start thinking that this is like the Empire Strikes Back, the problem was, for Rome, the problem was that by this point, a ton of damage had been done to the Western state. And Peter Heather, in his book Empire and Barbarians, does an absolutely awesome job at explaining why in a way that we can understand. And so I'm going to quote it. Now, two very important things before I read this, very important, so listen. First, if you're going to retain anything from this episode, what I'm about to read is probably the thing you want to retain, because it's a crunchy fact about everyone's favorite topic that you can carry with you for the rest of your life. So again, if you're kind of on cruise control, this is the thing to turn up the volume at and put to memory. And second, there's a lot of dates and figures in this quote. So my advice is to either ignore them completely and just listen to the basic gist, or give it a rewind and listen to it twice, because again, this is the 800-pound gorilla of topics in Western Civ, and if there's one thing to remember about it, it's this. So, it's worth a second spin at bat, so to say. Also, real quick before I quote this, when Peter Heather uses the term immigrant, he's referring to these Germanic migrating tribal armies. Okay, I quote. The connection between immigrant violence and the collapse of the Western Empire could not be more direct. In simple terms, Rome taxed a comparatively developed agricultural economy in order to fund its armies and other structures. There were other sectors to the economy, but no one thinks that agriculture constituted anything less than 80% of the gross imperial product, like GDP. And many scholars would put that figure much higher. In this context, the activities of the immigrants had direct effects on imperial tax revenues, and in doing so, they materially diminished the state's capacity to survive. Because any loss of territory to an immigrant group, such as the Spanish provinces to the Rhine invaders in 410, meant that the area concerned was no longer contributing to central imperial coffers. Additionally, provinces caught up in any fighting, even if not conquered outright, were also much less able to pay their taxes. He's going to give a few examples now. Nearly a decade after they had been occupied for only 2 years by Alaric's Goths, the provinces around the city of Rome were still being assessed at only 1/7 of the normal tax rate. That's 14% of the normal tax rate, 14% of the total tax rate they were paying before. A similar rebate was also granted to 2 North African provinces, which were not part of the Vandal Alon kingdom of the 440s. Sorry, folks, we're going to talk about that in a bit, but the Vandals and Alans eventually get to North Africa. Spoiler, apologies, but I continue. A 6/7 reduction was perhaps generally granted, therefore, to provinces that had been heavily fought over. Once you start adding up the tally of lost and damaged provinces with the Western Empire's landed tax base in mind, the extent of the problem posed by immigrants quickly comes into focus. As early as 420, Britain had been definitively lost to central Roman control, along with the Garonne Valley, that's Aquitaine, being granted to the Visigoths. In addition, most of Spain had been taken or fought over by the Rhine invaders, and much of central and southern Italy damaged in the course of the Visigoths' stay there between 408 and 410. The reduction in tax revenues caused by all these losses shows up beautifully in a late Roman register of military and civilian officials called the Notitia Dignitatum, which includes a listing of the Western Empire's armies dating to the early 420s. By this point, about half of the field army regiments, as constituted in 395, had been destroyed in the intervening quarter century, but over half of the replacement units now incorporated into that army were simple old garrison troops upgraded on paper to field army status. So not only had field army losses not been replaced with troops of top quality, but neither is there any sign that the upgraded garrison forces had been replaced at all. Quality and quantity, therefore, had declined drastically as a direct effect of the erosion of the empire's tax base. Worse was to follow. By 445, the Western Empire's richest provinces, he lists several in North Africa, again, apologies folks, we're going to get into this in a moment, had succumbed to the Vandals, and part of Pannonia, that's modern-day Hungary, to the Huns, while Burgundians and some other Alans had been granted smaller parts of Gaul in the mid-430s. At this point, something close to 50% of the Western Empire's tax base had been eroded, and the money was running out. He goes on later to say that, I quote, "By the mid-460s, the Western Empire, bled dry of declining tax revenues, was a shadow of its former self and unable to confront with any chance of success the Visigoths, Vandals, and others." End quote. In the last episode, if you recall, Alaric was elected as king of the Visigoths when they rebelled in 395. And what Peter Heather is saying here is that in the 30-ish years after that, the years we covered in the latter part of the last episode with all that fighting between the Visigoths and the East Romans, and then everything we've covered in this episode so far, that those 30 years were so violent that half the Western Empire's high-quality field army regiments had been destroyed. And that, while the Emperor, Honorius, had successfully forced the Visigoths out of Italy and cut that deal with them, if you remember, so much looting and destruction had taken place that this inner heart of the Western Imperial Corps could simply no longer afford to rebuild the same army that it had before. Because while the Roman military machine was awesome, it was an incredibly expensive machine that required a lot of money to build and operate and maintain. A good modern way to think about this is to think about the Legion like it's a very high-end sports car that runs off premium fuel and, $40,000 annual maintenance bills at the dealership. Because all the great things that the Legion could do during the late Imperial period were made possible by the extensive training and the drilling and the expensive weapons and armor and the expensive logistical support and the high salaries and bonuses that were paid to motivate men to fight. In other words, the Roman military machine that you and me and everyone loves wasn't great because legionnaires were superhuman, but rather it was great because Roman money, combined with Roman planning and leadership, created a machine so effective that it had conquered almost all the known world that was defensible and worth conquering around it. But the problem that Peter Heather is spelling out for us in this quote is that the money that it took to build and maintain this expensive Maserati of a military machine had been stolen. And the economic machine that was the Western imperial core had been disrupted. And because these weren't the days of the Republic with, Cato the Elder and Scipio Africanus, where Rome could lose something like 60,000 men and half the Senate at the Battle of Cannae to Hannibal, then just turn around and put 100,000 men under arms within 2 years, because those days were long gone, there weren't many ways to alleviate the situation. And that wasn't because Italy didn't have a ton of people still. It was because of all those things we spoke about in the last episode, that those old school Roman martial and civic virtues, fight and die for your people and your gods, were no longer there. Why? Again, take your pick. Because, like we spoke about in the last episode, people have been arguing about this for centuries, blaming everything from Jesus and Christianity to people just going soft, to the decline in the Roman family unit, or the low birth rates among the nobility, to Rome importing too many foreign slaves and hollowing out the middle class to the point where Italy had basically become an economic zone as opposed to a land farmed by a sturdy, robust group of small landowners unified by a shared heritage. It doesn't matter to me what reason you want to pick. There's a long list that you can choose from. As before, I have the ultimate cop-out because this episode and the last one is about the German conquest more than anything. But the point here is that the days of Rome being able to ring the alarm bell and conscript 100,000 willing to fight Romans under arms in a pinch were long gone. And in its place was this Maserati pay-to-play model. Still powerful, but only when you could afford to buy it and fill it up with premium fuel and foot the repair bill. And if you can't, well, therein lies the problem. By the way, for the curious, I've uploaded an image of this Notitia Dignitatum document that Peter Heather was talking about because it has a cool page full of different shield patterns that may represent Roman army units in the 420s. See images 2A and 2B. And I say may because the Notitia Dignitatum is a medieval copy of a lost original, so grains of salt. But what made this entire situation even worse for the Western Empire was the fact that while they were looking in between the couch cushions for spare change to fill up the proverbial Maserati, the Germans didn't have manpower problems to the same degree. Now, caveats. The Germans were acutely aware of the fact that it was very hard for them to replace their losses as well, and we know this because accounts have come down to us that show how anxious they would get when elements of the tribe's retainer contingent, if you remember from last time, these retainers being the inner core Navy SEAL element of these tribal armies, that they would get very anxious when the retainer group would suffer losses because, the Navy SEAL type guys that form the inner iron core of these armies just aren't that replaceable. You can't pick up your Amazon app and have them delivered with 2-day shipping from the frontier. And while that is a challenge, that challenge is nowhere near as bad as the situation that Rome had to deal with. Because, like Peter Heather just described, Rome was playing a very different game. To use a sports analogy, Rome was playing a zone defense, which is hard to do because when you're trying to guard an area, you have to be successful all the time to keep your enemy out of said area. And that's a much bigger challenge than simply looking after your tribe's wagon train. I mean, a German king could literally stand on a hilltop and probably see his entire tribe's wagon train stretching out into the distance. That's not something you can do from, standing on the Palatine Hill in the city of Rome. And so Rome was playing a much harder game strategically. And what's worse is that by this time in the 400s AD, the people that it was playing against, the Germans that it was fighting against, were, by this point, very, very capable of going toe-to-toe with the legion. These were no longer the Germans of Arminius and the Teutoburg forest that needed everything to go just right to scrape out a win. And this is something I want to call out in the backdrop of the Peter Heather quote we just read, because most people, especially us Americans, either overtly or unknowingly have this implicit assumption that Rome's legions were it. That Rome had perfected the formula for transforming men into a military machine. That the Roman legion was kind of the end-all be-all of how to wage war in the ancient world. And this kind of thinking is subtle, but it's pervasive. You go ask a random dude off the street whether he's going to put his $20 on the German barbarians or the legion, and you and I both know what the average guy is going to say. It's, because it's like a truism most people unknowingly have that, even though everyone knows the empire fell, this belief that the legion was it kind of exists as a kind of impenetrable thought bubble in people's minds. And, I don't know why it is. Maybe it's because of Gladiator, right? Maybe it's because of Rome Total War. Most of us played that when we were kids. And so before we get into the end of the greatest empire in Western history, I want to read a few quotes to disabuse us of this notion so that we can all understand why an empire so big, so seemingly strong, could lose set-piece battles, not the Teutoburg Forest kind of battles, but battles on like a set-piece battlefield to people that they consider to be barbarians. And this first quote comes from the famous military historian Hans Delbruck, who, in his famous History of the Art of War, Volume 2, has this to say about the internal cohesion of these Germanic tribal armies. I quote, "What a mighty military strength must have been inherent in this people. In their raw, barbaric life close to nature, in constant battle with wild animals and neighboring tribes, every single one of them was conditioned to the highest degree of personal courage. The solidarity within itself of each group, which was at the same time clan and neighborhood, economic community, and military comradeship." He means there's no difference between, a family unit, a neighborhood, and a military unit, basically. I continue. "Under a leader whose authority in the daily routine of life extended over the entire existence of the group, in peace as in war, the cohesiveness was so tight that even the strictest discipline of a Roman legion could not overcome it. The psychological elements of which a Germanic army and a Roman legion were composed of were completely different, but the result was completely similar. The Germans did no training. The army hardly had any definite power of punishment, and certainly no serious one, and even the concept of real military obedience was unknown to the Germans. But the unbroken unity of the entire existence in which the group was melded together, and which is so inherent that it is called a community, village, comradeship, and clan in the historical accounts, this natural unity is stronger than the artificial unity that civilized peoples must seek to create through discipline. The Roman centuries, no doubt, surpassed their Germanic equivalents in the external compactness of their forming up, their approach march, and their attack, and in holding their direction and their alignment. But the inner firmness, the mutual reliance on each other that stems from strength of morale, was strong enough among the Germans to remain unshaken, even under conditions of outer confusion, complete breakup of the unit, and even occasional retreat. Every call of the leader was followed because each one knew that every other one would follow it. He then concludes, writing, "The real weakness of all undisciplined groups of warriors is panic. Germanic armies, however, even in retreat, could be brought to a halt and to a renewed advance by the word of their leader." End quote. What Hans Delbruck is saying here is that while these Germanic groups may not have looked as impressive as the Legion on the parade ground, they had an organic, natural social cohesion that Rome could only create artificially by installing discipline through drill and training. And if you want to know why Germanic tribes were like this, well, the answer has everything to do with the Roman frontier zone that we spoke about in part 1. That frontier zone was like a pressure cooker. It was a 2,000-mile-long, bloody, violent, Darwinian natural selection machine on steroids that selected tribes for exactly what Hans Delbruck is describing here: social cohesion, and therefore unit cohesion on the battlefield. Because you don't get to retain your privileged roost on the frontier. Remember, your very profitable position on the frontier where you can make money from trading and raiding and, diplomatic subsidies and all the other things. You don't get to keep that position unless you are extremely socially cohesive, and that cohesion transfers into the battlefield in the form of that natural unity and discipline that Hans Delbruck is talking about. And there's a great line I have in a book here from an American theology and history professor named James Russell, in which he talks about this phenomenon of how the entire frontier dynamic resulted in a society likely unprecedented in its solidarity and internal firmness, writing, I quote, "Since the early Germans could not rely upon the protection and assistance of a bureaucratic empire when they were threatened with attack or famine, it was incumbent upon each man and woman of the community to adhere to the fundamental socio-biological principle of group survival embodied in the bonds of familial and communal solidarity. One's status in society depended upon how closely one adhered to this fundamental principle. Those who behaved honorably, thereby contributing towards the advancement of their community, were materially rewarded and thus increased their power, wealth, and influence." End quote. Folks, Germans are like this even today. Seriously. They are the most severe and rule-abiding people you can imagine. I literally got yelled at by an old woman in Dusseldorf just for jaywalking once, and it was like noon on a Tuesday. And keep in mind, this is in the modern day. They're no longer in this extremely violent frontier zone, but they still got that dog in them. And so not only did they have extremely strong unit cohesion on the battlefield, but these militarized tribes also benefited from the fact that a large percentage of their male population could be counted on to fight. Because remember from last time, they're German, and upper-class German men fight. That is what they do. And so when these groups built their armies and crossed the frontier, the armies that marched across weren't small. Remember from before, an average-sized tribal army was around 10,000 men, with the larger Gothic armies numbering upwards of 20,000 men, usually. And folks, those are big numbers, especially when you keep in mind how many tribes will be part of the story. You have the Vandals, the Sueves, the Franks, the Burgundians, the Alemanni, then the Visigoths, and later the Ostrogoths. Just to name a few of the more major ones, we're not even talking about groups like the Gepids and the Heruli and others. And so, in the grand scheme of things, when you add all this up, that's a lot of Germans. That's a lot of sauerkraut that the Roman legion has to deal with. Especially when you consider the fact that the Western Empire in the early 400s likely, big grains of salt, likely only had somewhere in the ballpark of 125,000 to 170,000 men. And this figure, it's very contentious, but I got this figure from a 2023 dissertation from Thomas Moffat, which was the most recent estimate I could find on this exact topic the size of the Western Roman legion in the early 400s when this Notitia Dignitatum document was written. And while that might sound like a lot of men, 125,000 to 170,000, that's a big force, right? But remember what Peter Heather was saying earlier, that a very large share of that total were garrison troops that were simply upgraded on paper to field army status. And so, in terms of the actual high-end Roman field armies, the Roman Maserati units called comitatenses, if you're curious, many of you will probably be familiar with that word. That's what they were called at this time, comitatenses. I use the word legionnaire just for simplicity. But that big number gets much smaller when you factor in, again, the fact that not all of them were part of the high-end Maserati comitatenses field army units. And so you can begin to see the scale of the problem, that the Germans kind of had the budget soldier, They had the budget soldier that could go toe-to-toe with the much more expensive to train and maintain legionnaires. That's what the frontier Darwinian pressure cooker produced. A large number of men who were able and willing to fight and who, very important, weren't just going to put down their swords if their leaders proverbially missed payroll for a few months. Because what are they going to do? Go back across the Rhine and Danube and suffer under the Huns? Good luck. Have fun with that. It's a very different thing than the Legion. You miss payroll with the Legion, that Legion may not go out and fight the Germans like you wanted to, and worse, it could end up fighting you if you don't pay it. Again, so Rome had a much harder game that it was playing. That's the point. But in spite of this much harder game that Rome was playing, in the backdrop of Gaul, Spain, and Italy being looted, and England just being an afterthought at this point, everything on the north bank of the Mediterranean is kind of kaput based on what we've been talking about. In spite of all of that, Rome limped on. And the reason why is that Rome could still draw tax revenue from one of the richest provinces in the Western Empire. And that province was North Africa, because North Africa was rich. And this is one of those fun facts that always surprise people, even people familiar with the Roman Empire and who are into history. And it's understandable because the area is definitely not rich today. I mean, they literally filmed the original Star Wars Tatooine scenes, all the desert scenes, like 200 miles south of Carthage. And so, people picture North Africa in their minds, they don't think, rich, developed agricultural zone. But back during the Roman imperial period, North Africa was filled with highly developed farming estates, which made it into the breadbasket of the Western Mediterranean. It's interesting how things change. But to help you visualize this in your mind, listen to this quote from Edward Gibbon's famous History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. I quote, "The long and narrow track of the African coast was filled with frequent monuments of Roman art and magnificence, and the respective degrees of improvement might be accurately measured by the distance from Carthage and the Mediterranean. A simple reflection will impress every thinking mind with the clearest idea of fertility and cultivation. The country was extremely populous. The inhabitants reserved a liberal subsistence for their own use, and the annual export, particularly of wheat, was so regular and plentiful that Africa deserved the name of the common granary of Rome and of mankind." End quote. This peaceful, productive coastal region in North Africa was put on a very different trajectory when Rome signed that 418 deal with the Visigoths, because part of the requirements for that deal before signing it was for the Visigoths to make a good pre-deal, good faith effort by attacking that group of Vandal, Alon, and Suev Rhine invaders who had taken over Spain, again as a kind of pre-deal, good faith, show how much you want the deal kind of thing. And this act of Rome directing its soon-to-be allies, the Visigoths, to attack the Rhine invaders in Spain might be the world's greatest case of be careful what you wish for. Maybe big mistake number 2 after killing Stilicho and doing that pogrom on the Germans in Italy like we talked about earlier. Because when the Visigoths did as they were told and defeated these Rhine invaders in a large battle in Spain, the Vandal element of that army didn't just keel over and die or melt away into obscurity. Now, the Sueves did. They went to northern Portugal and northwestern Spain. They retreated further into the Spanish hinterlands. But the Vandals went south and carved out a small kingdom in southern Spain. And after a few years decided, hey, instead of this small slice of Spain that we've been forced into, why don't we just invade North Africa? Which is exactly what they did, crossing Gibraltar in 429 under the leadership of a very ambitious king named Gaiseric. And they took advantage of yet another Roman civil war whose chaos enabled them to land and began a slow, decade-long campaign across North Africa, sacking towns and raiding the countryside, doing exactly what they did in Gaul when they made it into a funeral pyre, and gradually destroying the Roman forces as they made their way slowly to Carthage. And again, to help you visualize this, here's what Gibbon has to say about it. I quote, "The wandering Moors, as they gradually ventured to approach the seashore in the camp of the Vandals, must have viewed with terror and astonishment the dress, the armor, the martial pride and discipline of the unknown strangers who had landed on their coast, with the fair complexions of the blue-eyed warriors of Germany forming a very singular contrast with the swarthy or olive hue which is derived from the neighborhood of the torrid zone." He continues later, writing, "On a sudden, the 7 fruitful provinces, from Tangier to Tripoli, were overwhelmed by the invasion of the Vandals. The Vandals, where they found resistance, seldom gave quarter, and the deaths of the valiant countrymen were atoned for by the ruins of the cities under whose walls they had fallen. Careless of distinction or age, or of sex or rank, they employed every species of indignity and torture to force on the captives a discovery of their hidden wealth." End quote. And this is part of the story I find so interesting, because when the Vandals defeated the Roman garrison, they established a literal pirate kingdom in the region, conquering Corsica, Sardinia, and Sicily, and they engaged in so much plundering that the Germans called the Western Mediterranean the Wendel Sea, literally the Sea of the Vandals, with Vandal maritime raids stretching as far afield as Greece. And this part of the story is just so wild to me because, can you design something more interesting, even like a simulation? That you had blue-eyed, blonde-haired Germans running what people in the medieval period would call a Viking kingdom out of North Africa. I have here in the notes in front of me that the Vandals even sailed to Italy and sacked Rome once for good measure in the 450s, during which, fun fact, they stole a giant menorah that Rome had looted from Jerusalem's temple previously, and they brought it back to North Africa as loot. And this Vandal problem of them controlling a super productive area of the Western imperial core and, raiding across the central and western Mediterranean was so bad that in 468, the Eastern and Western empires put together a massive fleet, possibly numbering around 1,100 ships and 100,000 men, according to sources from the time period, but again, that might be a bit exaggerated, to crush this Vandal kingdom. And the Vandal king at the time, still Gaiseric, still the ambitious guy that took them across Gibraltar in 429, he tricked the Roman commander by engaging in peace talks for 5 days until the wind started blowing towards the Roman fleet, after which the Vandals sent fire ships into it, meaning, for those of you who don't know, unmanned ships packed full of things that burn, and the wind pushed these fire ships right into the Roman flotilla, burning much of it, and causing enough chaos that the Vandal fleet was able to ram and sink hundreds of ships, killing possibly 10,000 men, again, according to records that have come down to us in the time period. And again, just pause and take that in for a moment. This is a big episode and there's a lot of detail, but think about how wild that story is. That an almost entirely German confederation moved to 2,400 miles from Poland to North Africa, where it ran what was basically a Viking operation that saw blue-eyed, blonde-haired Germans bring a giant Jewish menorah originally from the temple in Jerusalem back to North Africa, and then defeat a massive east and west naval expedition of potentially 100,000 plus men using fire ships. It's the craziest story ever. And it's just wild that a movie hasn't been made out of it, but Hollywood does its thing. And while all this was going on in the south, nothing good for Rome was happening north of the Alps in Gaul in the mid-400s either, where to pivot our gaze north to Gaul for a moment. Peter Heather describes the Frankish behavior in the mid-400s like a cat-out-of-the-bag situation, where because Roman power was diminished, the Franks pounced, pardon the pun, on every opportunity they could, oftentimes working with the Romans, at one point allying with them to fight a major incursion of Huns across the Rhine, but eventually going on to attack basically every group in Gaul, from the Visigoths to a Roman breakaway state, to the Burgundians, literally everyone, all to slowly expand Frankish territory throughout the 400s and 500s, something that gradually established the heartland of what we today see as France. And things were even more chaotic further to the north, where, in the mid-400s, England was taken over by Saxons from northern Germany. Now, for some context here, because we've entirely ignored England so far, remember that England had been abandoned by the legions ever since 407, when that usurper Constantine III had rebelled and taken the legions in England south across the Channel to confront the Rhine invaders initially. And the key thing here is that those legions never went back to England. And so the landed Roman aristocracy that was left in England, which historians call the Romano-British, didn't have anyone to protect them. And so sometime, we don't know when, but sometime in the early 400s, Roman England began to get raided by tribes of Picts from modern-day Scotland. And in their panic over what to do, they made the decision to invite Anglo and Saxon warriors from northern Germany across the North Sea to serve as mercenaries, only for said mercenaries to realize England's weakness, basically realize it was just this giant plump fruit waiting to be plucked, then go on to bring all of their friends and family over the North Sea with them and conquer England for themselves. And so, zooming up into space here and looking down for a moment, by the mid-400s, North Africa was lost, the Mediterranean islands of Corsica, Sardinia, and Sicily were lost, and England was lost, and so the Western Empire was just Italy, which, as you know, had been looted decades before, as well as a few trace parts of Gaul, which had also been looted. Remember, all of Gaul smoked like a funeral pyre. And while the empire did strike back in the late 450s and retook some of Gaul and Spain for a brief moment under the leadership of an incredibly underrated emperor named Majorian, he was assassinated in 461, and so these territories he had managed to brilliantly seize were quickly lost again. But the end of the empire didn't happen until the late 400s, and the way it ended is sad in how anticlimactic it was. It sucks for us because for all of Rome's glory, it would have been a far more epic end if some massive earth-shattering battle had happened in Italy, with Germans throwing themselves like orcs up against the walls of Rome. But instead, in the end, it was just infighting in the Roman government that led to a German general taking over, who then simply retired the last Roman emperor named Romulus Augustulus in 476, thus ending the Western Roman Empire forever. I have a short list in front of me of various epic quotes from academics who, because everyone has their own ultra-distilled awesome paragraph with which they reflect on the past glory of the empire. But for the sake of time here, I'm just going to read one of them. And we're going to hear from the same economic historian and medievalist we heard from in the last episode, Eileen Powers, who had this to say about the topic in the early 1900s. I quote, "Above all, Roman civilization was a civilization of the mind. It had left behind a long tradition of thought and of intellectual achievement, the legacy of Greece, to which it had, in turn, made its own contribution, The Roman world was a world of schools and universities, writers and builders. The barbarian world was a world in which the mind was in its infancy, and its infancy was long. The battle sagas of that race, which have all but disappeared or have survived only as legends worked up in a later age, the few rude laws which were needed to regulate personal relationships, this was hardly civilization in the Roman sense. She gives some examples now. King Childeric, a Frankish king, trying to make verses in the style of Sedulius, a Roman poet, could not distinguish between a long foot and a short, and they are all hobbled, meaning his poetry sucked. Charlemagne himself, going to bed with a slate under his pillow in order to practice in the watches of the night that art of writing which he never mastered, what have they in common with Julius Caesar or Marcus Aurelius and that great Julian they call the apostate? They sum up in their very personas the whole wide gulf that yawned between Germany and Rome. End quote. Thus passes the Western Empire, an entity that had existed in various shapes and forms for almost 1,000 years, who had created Europe's first truly modern metropolitan civilization, now done. Done in by people they considered savages. I've uploaded a map of Europe in 500 AD, 2 maps, actually. See images 3A and 3B in my Twitter profile, again, in the highlights section, which show Europe at the dawn of the medieval period. And this is the medieval period now, by the way. Rome falls, the medieval period begins. For those of you who are driving and can't see the maps I've uploaded, England in the north all the way to the wall was ruled by Angles and Saxons. Gaul, modern-day France, was divided between Franks in the north, Visigoths in the southwest, and Burgundians in the east, with the Visigothic kingdom extending across the Pyrenees into Spain, encompassing most of Spain, with a tiny corner in northwestern Spain belonging to the Sueves. If you remember, one of the 3 Rhine invader tribes who, after getting slammed by the Visigoths, the Vandals went to Africa, the Sueves just went deeper into Spain, so they went into northwest Spain, north of Portugal. And at this point in 500 AD, Carthage, Corsica, and Sardinia belonged to the Vandals, and Italy and Sicily were run by a group we haven't spoken about yet, the Ostrogoths, who were a different group of Goths that had hopped across the Danube in the late 400s and conquered Italy. The new world I'm describing here that began to emerge from the ashes of the Western Empire will be an increasingly quieter one for more people in Europe, as the force for urbanization in Western Europe went away, and so less and less people lived their lives in large towns and cities with dense Roman-style apartment blocks where, you'd wake up to the sound of hundreds of people living their lives within a stone's throw of you every day. And so, while this might sound a bit hyperbolic, next time you go outside and touch grass, listen to the wind blowing through the trees. That is what this world began to transition to. That is how it would increasingly sound for most people. Decentralized, less complicated, and more rural and simplistic. And it's these more rural and simplistic societies and economies that underpin the modern world. Because the modern world stands on the shoulders of the medieval one. It's why we're speaking a Germanic language right now, English. That, while it was influenced by Latin and later Norman a bit, it is almost entirely Germanic at its core. And why are we speaking English right now? Why are we speaking a Germanic language in this podcast? Why aren't we speaking Latin? Because Rome fell. Rome doesn't fall, and you and I are probably having some different history podcast about maybe the victory of the Romans over the Germans in the end in Latin, but Rome falls, and so we're here speaking a German language on this podcast. And so, by this point, we finally arrive at the so what of this podcast episode and the last episode. And that reason is that the medieval world in which the Viking Age will take place in grows out of the ashes of the Western Roman Empire. But here's the thing. Here's the hugely important thing for what we're about to get into. This transition from classical civilization to a medieval one went down very differently in different places. for the simple reason that these conquered regions differed in their density of Roman civilization. And what I mean by this is that some places, as everyone knows, were super Romanized and had tons of cities and highly developed economies and large numbers of Roman aristocrats, while others had less people and less cities and less Roman culture and aristocrats and were less economically developed. All things that, as you can imagine, will hugely influence what the resulting post-Roman society will look like in different places. And so, when these conquering German tribes moved in, how German the resulting society would be differed very heavily. I racked my brain for a good analogy to help you build mental structure for what we're about to get into, but I couldn't come up with anything clever. So try and think about these new kingdoms like Jaeger bombs, the German liquor Jägermeister. I'm sure most of you guys have taken one of these at least once in your life. It's not something you tend to forget because Jägermeister literally tastes like licorice, and so, kind of makes an impression. It's a bad analogy, but roll with me here. Because for areas the Germans moved to that weren't super well developed, that didn't have a large network of cities and Roman populations and Roman aristocratic networks, that can kind of be understood like shooting Jägermeister straight up, straight Jägermeister from the German homeland. But areas that had dense populations and cities and, dense aristocratic networks, that's kind of like the traditional Jägerbomb, if you remember that viral video from the 2000s. You still taste the German in there, it just goes down easier. You don't notice it as much. For example, in the south, when the Ostrogoths conquered Italy in the very late 400s, somewhere around 100,000 of them moved into an Italy that already had several million people, meaning that the Ostrogoths likely never numbered more than 2 to 3% of the Italian population. And to put this figure into context in a way we can all relate to it, this is less of a demographic impact than occurred with the migrant wave that was brought to the U.S. in the early 2020s under the Biden administration. So, put that one in your thinking cap. So this means that the Ostrogothic kingdom was light on the Jägermeister scale. And this 2 to 3% share of the population matters because it meant that the Ostrogothic kings only ended up taking 1/3 of the Roman elite's land in Italy and other economic assets in order to reward their followers. And if it seems strange that they wouldn't just take everything, keep in mind that these German kings were perfectly aware that these places were rich because they were finely tuned economic machines that had been running just fine for centuries. And the Roman aristocratic class that ran these estates were a key part of that highly efficient economic machine. So it wasn't lost on them that, wholesale destruction of the Roman elite class would sort of kill the goose that laid the golden egg, so to say. And plus, the East Roman Empire next door to Italy was still very powerful, and so having a light-ish touch went a long ways to avoiding friction with the East Romans in as much as that was possible. To give you a sense of how these land seizures went down, and I love this part of the story, by the way, I think you will too. The way this was managed was that the Ostrogothic king would select rich estates that had aristocratic villas on them, which a villa was like a really nice, luxurious home that these aristocrats put in the middle of their large land holdings from which they managed said land holdings. And the reason I love this so much is because these villas were awesome. Any of you today would count yourself as lucky to live in one. Because listen to how the historian that we heard from earlier, Eileen Powers, describes the villa of a man named Sidonius, then quotes Sidonius writing about his own villa. And I love this so much, and I think you will too, so I'm going to quote it. There is the luxurious villa, with its hot baths and steaming pool, its suites of rooms, its views over the lake, and there is Sidonius, inviting his friends to stay with him or sending round his compositions to the professors and the bishops and the country gentlemen. Sports and games are very popular. Sidonius rides and swims and hunts and plays tennis. In one letter, he tells his correspondent that he has been spending some days in the country with his cousin and an old friend, whose estates adjoin each other. They had sent out scouts to catch him and bring him back for a week, and took it in turns to entertain him. There are games of tennis on the lawn before breakfast, or backgammon for the older gentlemen. There is an hour or two in the library before we sit down to an excellent luncheon followed by a siesta. Then we go out riding and return for a hot bath and a plunge in the river. I should like to describe our luscious dinner parties, he concludes, but I have no more paper. However, come and stay with us and you shall hear all about it. End quote. It's a beautiful window into the past because you can see it. And you gotta love stuff like this when people describe life in a way it's almost timeless because, again, you can see it, you can taste it, it's easy to visualize. It's almost like that old show MTV Cribs but the late Roman edition. And you offer this lifestyle to me today and I'd 100% take it. Swimming, tennis, riding horses, dinner parties, wasting my time with the local country gentlemen. I mean, hey, sign me up. I'm pretty sure I won't miss ordering slop on DoorDash, and I can put up with the occasional tooth pulling. And so you can begin to see why the Germans sought out these villas, because this is where they got to live the good life. Everything is there, just ready for you to step in and begin enjoying yourself. While, more importantly, they got to collect revenue from the semi-free tenant farmers who farmed the land around these estates. And this was the important thing because the farmers on these estates were legally bound to the land, meaning that they were used to the arrangement where they couldn't leave the estate without the landowner's permission, and they were also used to paying rent to the aristocrat at the villa in cash or in kind. And more importantly, they had agricultural knowledge that was literally light years ahead of anything the Germans would have been familiar with. And so these estates were perfect because you, Mr. German warlord, you and your retainers get the beautiful mansion and you get the bougie lifestyle along with a huge number of farmers who productively work the land and can provide you with food and leather and wine, you name it. And who are used to paying taxes and not being able to leave the estate. I mean, tell me how it's not perfect. And so these large estates were like hitting the easy button for these German warlords because a German lord and his retinue could just move in and let everything keep going just as it was before, in as much as that was possible. Which meant that the German warrior elite didn't have to get bothered with tasks like setting up tax systems or assigning and managing land holdings or anything like that. Things that couldn't be less interesting to men who had no intention of donning the toga and, managing farming operations, calculating figures, or figuring out how to maximize profitability. They didn't want to do that, nor did they want to send their sons to pursue Roman-style classical education and learn how to read. Rather, these groups wanted to keep their own culture, but rake in the cash so that they could maintain and equip their men with weapons and armor and horses and supplies, all so that they could be ready to deploy for seasonal campaigns, which is how these men expected to continue to make their real wealth. Because remember, they're German, and upper-class German men fight. That's what they do. And so, even though these guys are now living around proof of unbelievable sophistication and complexity, walking amidst the aqueducts in the vast marbled cities, they chose to maintain their Germanic culture and warrior identity because they had seen what had happened to the Romans that had let themselves go soft. And the Ostrogoths that we're talking about here in Italy were so keen on this that they even went so far as to ban their young boys from attending school and holding civil office, while also banning Romans from serving in the military, so as to keep their people as the dominant warrior class. In a book that I have here that we'll talk about later on the conversion of the Germans by a book that was written by American theology and history professor James Russell, says that this effort to stay culturally separate was hugely intentional. That, they purposely did not want to adopt every aspect of classical culture. And you can't really blame them. Remember, we all have this American pro-Roman indoctrination, but you yank one of these Germans through a time portal from the 400s to now, and they'd probably laugh. Like, why are you admiring this? They lost. They got soft, they got corrupt, they lost their social cohesion, and we, a people outnumbered 50-1, walked in and now rule them. Here's how the great Edward Gibbon, in his famous Decline and Fall of the Western Roman Empire, describes what I'm talking about here. I quote, "Fashion and every convenience soon persuaded the conquerors to assume the more elegant dress of the natives, but they still persisted in the use of their mother tongue, and their contempt for the Latin schools was applauded by the Ostrogothic king Theodoric himself, who gratified their prejudices and his own by declaring that the child who trembled at the rod would never dare look upon a sword." The rod meaning a teacher's disciplinary rod. He continues later, writing, "These mutual conversions were not encouraged by the policy of a monarch who perpetuated the separation of the Italians and the Goths, reserving the former for the arts of peace and the latter for the service of war." End quote. There's a first-person account that has come down to us from this time period that, to me, exemplifies this contrast between the Roman and German aristocratic culture. One genteel and educated and the other warlike. And this is a bit of a tangent from our story, but if you're like me, you'll probably get a kick out of it. But remember, this is a brief hiatus. But this story comes to us from the early 500s in Ostrogothic Italy, when an East Roman army invaded it to try and retake it for the East Romans. And before one of the battles, the Ostrogothic king at the time, named Totila, did something that, to me, forms an absolutely pristine, picture-perfect contrast to the ethos of the Roman elite that they had just partially replaced. For context, this quote begins right before the battle when this Totila, remember, the king of the Ostrogoths at the time, had learned that some of his warriors were nearby, and so he needed to stall for time. And here's what the East Romans recorded him as doing to achieve that. This is what he did to stall for time. For the curious, this comes from the highly trusted East Roman historian Procopius in his History of the Wars, Volume 3. Totila rode out alone into the space between the two armies, not to challenge anyone to individual combat, but to gain time, for he had received a report that 2,000 Goths were nearby, and he did not want to start the battle before their arrival, so he did the following. First, he wanted to show the enemy what kind of man he was. He was wearing armor completely decorated with gold, and from his helmet and his spear there floated purple plumes of great beauty, appropriate for a king. Riding on a splendid horse, he manipulated his weapons expertly in the open space. First, he made his steed make the most graceful turns and jumps. Then at full speed, he threw his spear high into the air, and as it fell spinning, he caught it in the middle. He caught it in skill for alternation, first in the right hand, then in the left, thus showing his agility. He jumped down from his horse to the rear and to the front, as well as on both sides, then sprang up again like one who has practiced the art of riding ever since his youth. He spent the whole morning in this activity." End quote. A German king in gold-decorated armor, flexing on an East Roman army by chucking and catching spears at full gallop with his offhand, is to me the perfect, absolutely perfect, distilled encapsulation of the medieval world having a close encounter with the classical one. Because this kind of ethos is a world away from the late Roman imperial elite, who had a far more Napoleonic, lead from the command center kind of ethos. And while that sounds less cool, keep in mind that Totila did die at this battle, so there's that. We might all love the super hardcore, watch me catch spears my offhand in front of your army in gold-decorated armor kind of attitude, but it didn't come without risks. And this is one of those things that just sets the medieval period apart. And it's something that Hollywood, with its addiction to anti-Western subversion, almost never plays up or puts in a good, positive light. And that's that if there was ever a testosterone-maxing culture, it feels like it's this rapidly emerging medieval world that we're getting into here. Because if you were a German of any importance, you were raised eating a protein and fat-heavy diet. And so you were big. and you learned how to hunt, and you were raised with the expectation that fighting was your primary job. And you combine that with an aristocratic value system that placed huge emphasis on personal strength and bravery and dignity and pride, all things that we'll hammer home a bit further in the next few episodes. Everything you just saw here with Totila, basically, it's just hard not to see this as the most masculine, the most testosterone maxing culture ever seen in the West over the past 2,000 years. But, this is my non-academic hot take. Feel free to disagree with me on Twitter. But I mean, these days, if you handed a shovel to any of our business and political leaders, they'd probably break in half, with the exception of Bezos. But, he's taken something that I need to start taking. But this is, again, just something I wish Hollywood would let shine through, but that's just not going to happen. The point here, though, is that these Ostrogoths and all the other Germans we're talking about in this episode, by the way, they all remained a warrior class. But at least for the Ostrogoths, this didn't mean that they ruled like barbarians. Because remember, they were lower on the Jägermeister scale. For example, to toss out a few anecdotes, on the advice of his Roman advisors, and he had Roman advisors, by the way, that Ostrogothic king Theodoric, the initial king of the Ostrogoths that conquered Italy initially, he sponsored Latin schools for the native Roman population to stand up the Roman civil service. And he built Roman-style palaces. And, just listen to this letter I'm about to read that this King Theodoric probably wrote himself, by the way. He was educated in Constantinople as a youth. Interesting guy. But listen to this letter that he wrote to the East Roman Emperor in Constantinople. Now, context, because we're jumping around a lot. I read this letter just to emphasize that these kingdoms in the south weren't, pure Jägermeister barbarians. But some context around this letter, not that it's important. Theodoric was the letter that we're about to read, Theodoric was trying to get the East Roman Emperor off his back, basically to get him to stop plotting with his enemies. But we don't read it for that reason. We read it because the writing is just really interesting, and it just drives home this low position on the Jägermeister scale where the Ostrogoths were, at least, the king and some of them. This comes from the Peter Heather translation, by the way. I quote, "You are the fairest ornament of all the realms. You are the healthful defense of the whole world, to which all other rulers rightfully look up with reverence. We, above all, who by divine help learned in your republic the art of governing Romans with equity. Our royalty is an imitation of yours, modeled on your good purpose, a copy of the only empire. Insofar as we follow you, do we excel all other nations. We think that," and by the way, this is when he asks to get off his back, "we think that you will not suffer that any discord should remain between our two republics, which are declared to have ever formed one body under their ancient princes, and which ought not to be joined together by a mere sentiment of love, but actively to aid one another with all their powers. Let there always be one will, one purpose in the Roman kingdom." End quote. It's interesting, isn't it? Ostrogoths still, warrior elite. Kings are catching spears in their offhand, and Theodoric, educated in Constantinople, penning a very eloquently written letter to the East Roman Emperor. And so, while the Germans stayed separate, they retained their warrior class. They worked closely with the Romans, they built Roman schools, they built Roman palaces, and they sent perfumed letters like this to the emperor. So they were civilized, in as much as a barbarian could be. And fun random fact here, before we kind of skip to the Vandals, Edward Gibbon talks about how Theodoric maintained close relations with the Ostrogoths' cousins in Scandinavia, and they imported furs and amber from Sweden as luxuries for his Goths in Italy. But that aside, this trend of kingdoms in the south being low in the Jägermeister scale also applies to North Africa and the Vandal kingdom that we spoke about earlier. Because like the Ostrogoths, the Vandals were also hugely outnumbered by the Roman subjects that they ruled over, and so they only ended up seizing estates in one of the 3 Roman provinces there when they conquered it. And so like the Ostrogoths, they softened, just a little bit. Still a German warrior culture, but one that was lower on the Jägermeister scale. And there's a fun report that we have that shows this, which has come down to us from the same East Roman historian Procopius that we heard from a moment ago with the spear catching thing. Now, caveats, grains of salt, what you're about to hear is going to sound a bit like Roman propaganda, but keep in mind that Procopius saw what you're about to hear with his own eyes because he was part of an East Roman expeditionary force that would eventually retake North Africa. But historians tend to trust him. They consider him reliable for a whole laundry list of reasons, chief among them the fact that they've discovered a secret memoir of his, a memoir in which Procopius spells out his biases and his hatred and of certain people and his worldview and stuff like that. And so for historians, it's like discovering the Ark of the Covenant because, they can then compare that to his published histories and kind of read between the lines and get comfortable with claiming that something is more objective than it might otherwise be without, having someone's inner thoughts that they've been able to discover. So that said, here is what this Procopius says about the Vandals in North Africa. For the curious, as always, I'm reading from Henry Dewing's translation of Procopius's History of the Wars, Volume 2. I quote, "The Vandals, having taken possession of the land, made it their own, and they dwelt in houses adorned with gold and precious stones, and they went to the baths every day, and their tables were loaded with all manner of delicate meats and drinks, and they wore garments of silk, and passed their time in theaters and hippodromes," meaning chariot racetracks, "and in other pleasurable pursuits, and above all else in banquets. And the Vandals were delighted with these things, and their feasts were especially splendid, with a great abundance of meats and drinks and all manner of sweet things, set forth on tables of silver and gold. And they invited many to these banquets, making a display of their wealth, and they lived in this manner, forgetful of their former toils and hardships." End quote. Even if this is just semi-accurate, think about how far the Vandals had come from the brutal Darwinian pressure cooker of the frontier just a century before. And so, the tribes that conquered into the densely populated and rich imperial core lived a luxurious Roman-style life. They rubbed shoulders with Roman aristocrats, still Germans, still able to catch spears in their offhand at full gallop and not wanting their kids to study, but way more polished and genteel than the new barbarian kingdoms that sprung up north of the Alps. And this is where things will get a bit more fun. I know we're getting into a lot of detail here. I hope I'm not boring you, but this is when it gets a little bit more fun because we start to get further up on our Jägermeister scale. Things start to look a lot more heavy metal, and therefore more interesting. Because when we pivot our gaze north to the Visigothic and Burgundian kingdoms located in the modern-day regions of southwestern and southeastern France, things begin to get a lot less decadent and civilized and a lot more culturally German. Because while the tribes north of the Alps were still outnumbered by their new subjects, they weren't as outnumbered as the Ostrogoths and the Vandals were. And this, in combination with the fact that the lands north of the Alps were not as economically developed or as rich and productive, meant, and this is the thinking, that to reward their followers with wealth post-conquest, the tribes north of the Alps had to confiscate a larger share of the Roman elite's villas and landholdings. For example, according to Hans Delbruck, the Burgundians in modern-day southeastern France seized 2/3 of the Roman elite's land, and it's from these conquests in southern Gaul that we get what I consider to be the most hilarious and amusing first-hand account from this entire time period. Yeah, that's what I mean when I said it's going to get more fun when we get north of the Alps. Folks, what you are about to hear is solid gold, because one of the genteel, if not the most genteel, educated, blue-blooded Roman aristocrats in the region recorded his experience of having to deal with his new Burgundian overlords in the 470s. And as fate would have it, this comes from the exact same guy that we heard from earlier who was doing his MTV Cribs tour of his villa in that letter that we read. If you remember, the guy's name was Sidonius Apollinaris. And for context here, to kind of play up why this is such an awesome quote, this Sidonius was son-in-law to a past Roman emperor and he was the Christian bishop of a large Roman city called Clermont in central Gaul. And context for this quote comes in the aftermath of his unsuccessful defense of Clermont against a Visigothic and Burgundian army, after which he had to billet Burgundians at his villa while he lived there. Remember, the same villa we heard him bragging about earlier with the luscious dinner parties and the hot baths and the views overlooking the lake. And he wrote down his thoughts on this arrangement of how he felt about having to billet Burgundian warriors at his home with him. And again, it's just solid gold. Now, a few things. This is a poem and it's short. And so the best way to think about this is that it's like a really dry, sarcastic take on Twitter. And the second thing is that the context of this poem is that Sidonius is explaining to a friend why he missed their wedding and didn't write them a longer wedding poem as a gift. That's the backdrop here. Third thing, when Sidonius refers to long hairs, he is referring to Burgundians who, like all the Germans, kept their hair very long. And when he refers to rancid butter, he's referring to the Germanic custom of using butter as hair gel. Last thing here, again, I don't want to spoil the fun, but whatever. Last thing, when he refers to the lyre, that's Lyre, he's referring to a Germanic guitar-like stringed instrument, which I've uploaded videos and images of, see images 5, A, B, and C. So with that said, here's Andrew and I reading Sidonius Apollinaris.
Quid me, et si vale amparare Carmen fescen ni Nicola Juves Diones inter cri nigeras situm catervas, et Germanica verba sustinentem, laudantem tetrico subinde vultu.
How am I, even if I am otherwise able to do so, compose for the wedding feast while I sit here among the crowd of long hairs, listen to Germanic words, and have to praise with serious countenance the song sung by the gluttonous Burgundian who has salved his hair with butter?
Quod Burgundio cantat esculentus infundens acido com ambituro. Vis dicam tibi, quid poema frangat? Ex hoc barbaricis ab acta plecteris spernit senipedem stilum talia.
Need I say how this strangles my poetry? Fleeing from the barbarian lyre since she sees the 7-foot-tall gentleman around her, the muse may know no more about hexameter. Meaning, the Germanic guitar is ruining his poetry. He continues.
Ex quo septipedes videt patronos, felices oculos tuos et aures felicemque libet vocare nasum.
Happy may one consider your ears and eyes, and happy your nose, that early in the mornings are not assailed by 10 breakfasts belching out their odor of garlic and onions. You are not pounced upon even before daybreak by a herd of giants.
Die necorto, tot antique petunt simul gigantes, quod vix alcinovi cullina ferret.
End quote. The cope in seething is so thick you could cut it in the air with a knife. The righteous indignation that he, an educated man and son-in-law to the former emperor, has to sit there and force a smile through gritted teeth as some massive Burgundian greases his hair and eats him out of house and home. I mean, the picture's hilarious. And this poem is perfectly timed for our purposes because it was written exactly during this transition to the medieval world, that we're talking about here. And one could make the case that the Middle Ages was kind of sung into existence by Sidonius's Burgundian, as he no doubt drank Sidonius's fine Roman wine and strummed out a song on his lyre. And by the way, if you're curious about the lyre thing, I've uploaded a video of a master of the lyre strumming out Beowulf and reciting it in the epic style in Old English. And this is one of those times where if you can pause, it's 100% worthwhile to check out. The video is of a guy named Benjamin Bagby, and this guy is like a gift to mankind because his Beowulf is a solo act and he does it from memory and he plays the lyre and he recites Beowulf again in the epic style with which it would have been recited in the mead halls of Northern Europe. And it's a treasure. It's worth referencing. Again, highlights section of my Twitter profile, image 5D. But to get back to our story here, Sidonius is also worth quoting, not just because it's fun and interesting, but because he's the perfect example of this partial replacement of the Roman elite that happened north of the Alps in Gaul. Because while Sidonius may have hated his new German overlords, and we know he did, because we have other letters and he says so very, very directly, both he and his grandson would still go on to attain high positions in the church under the new German overlords. That was often how Romans north of the Alps kept their social and economic status, by joining the church. And so, while it's a new barbarian world north of the Alps in central and southern Gaul, it wasn't the end of the world for Romans like Sidonius. But when we pivot our gaze even further north to the kingdom of the Franks in northern Gaul, is where things start to look a lot more Germanic and heavy metal. And, we're almost getting to pure Jägermeister at this point, because Peter Heather believes the Franks replaced almost the entirety of the Roman elite, with only a few select Roman aristocrats preserving their status by becoming priests. Now, the Franks also saw, like the Germans in the south, the Franks also saw the sense in keeping that villa system intact, meaning that they allowed the semi-free Roman tenant farmers who had been working the land to remain on the land because, why not? Why break something that works, right? But while things may have not looked wholly different on the ground level, the upper crust of Frankish society was wholly Germanic. In other words, the elite class in northern Gaul was a Germanic warrior elite straight off the frontier. And to give you a visual to work with, here is how Gibbon introduces them in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And I love this because it's colorful. But heads up, when I read this quote, he's in the process of talking about their hair, as one does. So just context here. But I quote Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. I quote, "Their blonde hair, which they combed and dressed with singular care, hung down in flowing ringlets on their back and shoulders, while the rest of the nation were obliged, either by law or custom, to shave the back part of their head, and to comb their hair over their forehead, and to content themselves with the ornament of 2 small whiskers. The lofty statue of the Franks and their blue eyes denoted a Germanic origin. Their tight clothes accurately expressed the figure of their limbs. A weighty sword was suspended from a broad belt, and their bodies were protected by a large shield. These warlike barbarians were trained from their earliest youth to run, to leap, to swim, to dart the javelin or battle axe with unerring aim, and to advance without hesitation against a superior enemy, and to maintain, either in life or death, the invincible reputation of their ancestors." End quote. And if you want to know what the king of these peoples was like, the first king of the Franks, named Clovis, well, he doesn't disappoint. Because listen to this story of how Clovis dealt with his problems. For the curious, the story dates to 486 AD, and it tells the story of how Clovis dealt with someone that had pissed him off. This comes from the Ernest Brujo translation of Gregory of Tours' History of the Franks, by the way. And Andrew and I, again, are going to read this one together. I quote,
Eo tempore multae ecclesiae a Clodoveco exercitu depredatae sunt, quia erat ille ad hoc fanaticis erroribus involutus, igitur, de quadam ecclesia urgium mirae magnitudinis ac pulchritudinis hostes absulerant, cum reliqua ecclesiastici ministerii ornamenta.
"At that time, many churches were despoiled by Clovis's army, since he was as yet involved in heathen error," meaning he hadn't converted to Christianity yet. I continue. "Now the Frankish army had taken from a certain church a vase of wonderful size and beauty, along with the remainder of the utensils for the service of the church. And the bishop of the church sent messengers to the king, asking that the vase at least be returned, if he could not get any more of the sacred dishes back.
Episcopus autem ecclesiae alius missus ad regem dirigit, poscendut, si aliud de sacris vasis recipere non mereitur, saltem vel urcium ecclesia sua reciperet.
Upon hearing this, the king said to the messenger, "Follow us as far as Soissons, because all that is taken is to be divided there, and when the lot assigns me that yonder dish, I will do what the bishop asks." This means that when it was Clovis's turn to choose from the loot pile, that he would choose the vase as part of his share and return it to the bishop. I continue. Then, when he came to Soissons, and all the booty was set in their midst, the king said, "I ask of you, brave warriors, not to refuse to grant me, in addition to my share, yonder dish." That is, he was speaking of the vase just mentioned. This means that Clovis wanted to set the vase aside, apart from the loot everyone takes their share of, meaning that he wanted to do the bishop a favor, but he didn't want it to cost him anything. He still wanted to take from the loot pile as well. I continue. In answer to the speech of the king, those of more sense replied, "Glorious king, all that we see is yours, and we ourselves are subject to your rule. Now do what seems well-pleasing to you, for no one is able to resist your power."
Cum haecit dixissent, unus levis invidus ac facilis, cum voce magna elevatam bipennem urcio impulet digens, nihil hinc accipies nisi quae tibi sors vera largitur.
When they said this, a foolish, envious, and excitable fellow lifted his battle axe and struck the vase, and cried in a loud voice, "You shall get nothing here except for what the lot fairly bestows upon you." At this all were stupefied, but the king endured the insult with the gentleness of patience, and taking the vase, he handed it over to the messenger of the church, nursing the wound deep in his heart.
At ille, cum Paululum inclinatus fuisset ad collegendum, rex, elevatis manibus securem suam capita eos defixet. Sic, inquit, tu sexonas en urcio illo fecisti.
And at the end of the year, he ordered the whole army to come with their equipment of armor to show the brightness of their arms on the field. And when he was reviewing them all carefully, he came to the man who had struck the vase, and he said to him, "No one has brought armor so carelessly kept as you, for neither your spear nor sword nor axe are in serviceable condition." And seizing his axe, he cast it to the earth. And when the other had bent over somewhat to pick it up, the king raised his hand and drove his own axe into the man's head. "This," he said, "is for what you did to my vase at Soissons." End quote. Clovis taking revenge in public with his own hand tells you everything you need to know about how they did things in Germania. But the more subtle and interesting thing about this story is the power dynamic, because it's a world away from anything that would have been acceptable in the Roman Empire or even during the late medieval period. That a warrior who was junior enough that he had to stand in line for inspection felt so empowered by the egalitarian norms and traditions of the Germanic warband that not only did he call out the king to his face, but he went as far as to break the vase the king was clearly interested in. And after he did that, nothing happened. The guy just walked away unscathed. The king, Clovis, didn't fly into a rage or have the guy beheaded on the spot for the insult. He had to sit there and just shrug his shoulders and take it, only getting revenge later on. Folks, just think about that. Think about how weird that is with your concept of power dynamics. What you have in your head when you think about the way that, maybe in your mind, the way you might have thought early medieval kingdoms operated. Again, it's just a different world. And this vase story is also good for explaining exactly how far along on the Jägermeister spectrum we're talking about here, because while the Franks were far from the more Roman accommodating Vandals and Visigoths, the reason Clovis wanted the vase was because one of his Roman Christian advisors, the guy who would baptize him shortly after this, by the way, a guy named Remigius, the bishop of the Roman city of Reims, a guy who Clovis kept close to him for his entire life, asked him to get that vase to spare that vase from being hacked into hack silver and its pieces distributed among the warband. And keep in mind, he did try. And there's a painting made in the 1800s that perfectly illustrates this very barbarian, but not totally barbarian, part of the Jägermeister / how Germanic you are spectrum that the Franks fell into. I've uploaded it, see image 6. But for those that are driving, the painting is called The Education of the Children of Clovis, and it was made by a Dutchman named Lawrence Alma Tadema. And it shows Clovis watching his children chucking throwing axes at a wooden target in the middle of a beautiful Roman villa. And I don't know how much you guys are into paintings, but I love this painting because the contrast the painter makes between Clovis and his sons and his retainers versus the Roman building around them and the Roman Christian priests who stand in the background watching them is awesome. Because in this painting, for those of you who can't see, Clovis's sons, whose hair is long and blonde and who carry short swords, stand alongside long blonde mustached retainers on a beautiful marble floor, while Clovis's queen and the priests are clearly annoyed, by the way, they all sit along the edges of the courtyard, watch the children take turns chucking axes at a target. The contrast between all of this and the beauty of the Roman villa is awesome. And it perfectly represents where the Franks are on the Jägermeister spectrum. Still heavy metal Germans, but they have their priests, and they're willing to go out on a limb for them from time to time. But when we pivot our gaze north, across the English Channel, is where things get real heavy metal. This is where it's 100% Jägermeister, fresh and unwatered down, imported straight from Germania. Because the Angles and Saxons came in such force to England that the subsequent society they built made the kingdom south of the Channel look positively Roman by comparison. And here's what the great Edward Gibbon says about it. I quote, "The arts and religion, the laws and language which the Romans had so carefully planted in Britain were extirpated by their barbarous successors. After the destruction of the principal churches, the bishops who had declined the crown of martyrdom retired with the holy relics into Wales and northern Gaul. The remains of their flocks were left, therefore, destitute of any spiritual food. The practice, even the remembrance, of Christianity was abolished, and the British clergy might obtain some comfort from the damnation of the idolatrous strangers. The king of the Franks maintained the privileges of their Roman subjects, but the ferocious Saxons trampled on the laws of Rome and of the emperors. The proceedings of civil and criminal jurisdiction, the titles of honor, the forms of office, the ranks of society, and even the domestic rights of marriage, testament, and inheritance were finally suppressed, and the indiscriminate crowd of noble and plebeian slaves," he's referring to the former Romans here, "were governed by the traditionary customs which had been coarsely framed for the shepherds and pirates of Germany. The language of science, of business, and of conversation, which had been introduced by the Romans, was lost in the general desolation. A sufficient number of Latin or Celtic words might be assumed by the Germans to express their new wants and ideas, but those illiterate pagans preserved and established the use of their national dialect. Almost every name, conspicuous either in the church or state, reveals its Teutonic origin, and the geography of England was universally inscribed with foreign characters and names." End quote. In England, archaeologists find a complete and total breakdown of the pre-existing Roman economic system, meaning that the villas and the villa-based system of agriculture and organization were all completely done away with. And the disruption was so total that archaeologists even today can detect this change in the soil 1,500 years later. Because in soil layers dating to the 400s, archaeologists consistently find evidence of less developed agricultural technologies suddenly being used again. Why? Because the more agriculturally advanced Roman system and its Roman aristocracy and much of the Roman peasantry were done away with. They were either killed or ejected from their lands. And in their place, a huge number of Angles and Saxons from northern Germany took over, replacing said elites and much of the peasantry in what we today call the English lowlands. And then also in East Anglia, there's a hint in that name, Anglia, Anglia, as well as in Mercia and Northumbria. Basically everything but modern-day Wales, Cornwall, and Scotland. Historian Peter Heather likens this event to like a river of people flowing across the North Sea. And I love that visual because it just speaks to how Germanic post-conquest England was. And in a 2022 article I read in the Nature Journal by Wolfgang Hack and others, found that individuals during this time in the Midlands, basically central England, and East Anglia got 76% of their DNA from the Angles and Saxons. And when linguists look at the Anglo-Saxon language that would become Old English, they find very few instances where the conquering Germans adopted words from the Celtic language that was spoken there before their arrival. Something that speaks volumes, because the French language and other Romance languages in the modern day are the exact opposite. They have very few surviving Germanic words that come from the Franks and the Visigoths and the Burgundians and, all the others. But English is full of them. It's still almost an entirely Germanic language. Again, all because of what Peter Heather is speaking about here, of a river of people flowing across the North Sea from northern Germany to England. And I've uploaded a super interesting map of this, by the way. This one is worthy. It's interesting. See image 7, which shows a map of Anglo-Saxon settlements in England. And, what's interesting about this conquest is that it's very politically relevant in the modern day. And I say this mostly for my American listeners because Europeans will be very familiar with this, but, one of the narratives that's pushed by the powers that be in the media and on the internet and elsewhere calls into question whether the English are native to their land, whether the English are an ethnic group and whether the English have an ancestral claim to England itself, which of course they do. And the reason why is everything we're talking about here, that, like Peter Heather said, a river of people flowed across the North Sea. This was the most replacement level conquests of any of the conquests of the Western Roman Empire. It's such a crazy thing these days that we're in this spot where you have to debate whether the English are an ethnic group or whether the English have an ancestral claim to the land they conquered 1,600 years ago, but here we are. And I call it out again because understanding your history is so critical. It gives you a foundation to stand on, and it gives you the ability to look at these subversive narratives that are pushed and just completely reject them. You can look and say, of course we're an ethnic group. Of course we have a claim to the land we're on. We have 1,600 years of roots in the soil. And it just goes so far as to defusing all the ridiculousness that's pushed, in our modern age. So we have the Anglo-Saxon conquests that land the English in England, but there's one thing we haven't spoken about yet that completes the medieval soup that we're cooking up here. We've got ingredient number 1, the Germans, obviously, and then we have ingredient number 2, the remnants of classical Roman civilization, very important in most places south of England. But ingredient number 3 is one that we've only very briefly touched, and that's Jesus. Because Christianity is the third major ingredient that came together, like, if you guys ever played the Ocarina of Time, it's like the Triforce in Zelda that transformed Europe from the classical period into what you picture in your mind when you think of the word medieval. And the best way to think about how the conversion of the German tribes went down is to think about it like any relationship dynamic where, the person who's more into the relationship, who wants it to succeed more, tends to have less power because they have less leverage. I feel like all guys kind of realize this over time. They have one relationship where they're just way too into a girl and, obviously you're less willing to walk, and so you lose power and respect like immediately, and you kind of all of a sudden realize how this dynamic works. And we've all been in that position at least once in our lives. And if you haven't, it's the same power dynamic is relevant to your work. Because if you've ever had a job that you really needed and couldn't afford to quit, you lose leverage, you lose control because you're not just going to walk. You need it more than that job needs you. And this dynamic is exactly how the conversion of the German tribes went down. Because when Christianity, which had been on a conversion joyride washing across the Greek and Roman worlds pretty successfully for centuries, when Christianity hit the German world, it ran straight into a brick wall. And as a result, when the Germans and Jesus came together, it wasn't just a one-way thing, where the Germans took up with Jesus and became good God-fearing Christians. Rather, the Germans converted Christianity a bit too. And this fact lays at the root of the entire medieval church. It's why my launch post for this episode has a gif of a German handing a sword to Jesus. By the way, if you like the show so far, not to be annoying, but any comment or solid quote, retweet, endorsement is huge, very appreciated. But either way, no pressure. But the best way to explain what we're talking about here, to explain why Christianity hit a brick wall when it hit the Germans, is best done by first getting into why Christianity spread so fast among the Greeks and Romans. And this is something that has everything to do with what we spoke about in the last episode, about how during the 1st century BC and AD and onward, Rome began transforming away from, the robust, traditional, cohesive, culturally conservative country it had been under the Republic. After this, it began to fracture, if you recall, along almost every line you can imagine, by economic class, by race, after Rome imported slaves from all around it, something that hollowed out what had previously been a landscape farmed by small landowners who had formed the backbone of the legion early on, and also by religion, as various cults and mystical faiths from the East moved in, all things that eroded the traditional Roman family unit that had been the bedrock of the Republic for centuries. And all of this, remember, was happening to an increasingly urbanized society where increasingly higher fractions of the population lived in towns and cities, and, just like today, that led to social isolation by the exact same process that happens to people when people move to places like New York City today and sometimes feel lonely. Why? Because you might be in a massive city, but you're surrounded by 1,000 different types of people and cultures and belief systems and ways of life. And you combine this with the civil wars and the inflation that we spoke about in the last episode, and what you are looking at here with the Romans and by extension the Greek side of the Mediterranean that the Romans had conquered is a people that at least a fraction of them were suffering in a very, very real way in the centuries after Christ. Something that James Russell in his book, The Germanization of Early Medieval Christianity, believes made a fraction of the Roman population very ideologically available, meaning that they were open to new belief systems. An English classicist and historian, Robert Lane Fox, in his book Pagans and Christians, makes a very similar argument for the Greek-speaking half, again, of the Roman Empire around this time. And so all across the Mediterranean, the point here, all across the Mediterranean during the imperial period, you had cities that were increasingly ethnically diverse, with an increasing number of powerless, economically oppressed, and socially isolated people in the lower class that just didn't have a safety net. And then here comes Christianity. A friend of mine in Washington, D.C., who had a rough childhood, once told me that any raft is a life raft. And for our purposes here, Christianity was a really, really good life raft for people in this situation because it's a universal salvation religion, meaning anyone can join. It doesn't matter what race you are. It doesn't matter where you came from. Anyone can join. And its promise of eternal bliss in the afterlife is attainable no matter how wealthy you are. And on top of this, Jesus upheld the downtrodden, that existed in the core of the Roman cities. I mean, just listen to his most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, because it hammers home exactly what Christianity's appeal was. And if you're not familiar with this, I'm going to read it here. It's short. And I'm going to read, this comes from the book of Matthew, by the way, who records Jesus as saying, I quote, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." End quote. Folks, this is a religion you couldn't design better. If someone came up with like a religion simulator video game where you design a faith to maximize its spread under late Roman imperial conditions, this is exactly what you design. And so here comes Christianity and the early Christian communities who looked out for one another and fed the hungry and cared for the orphans and looked out for the widows, all things that offered an instant supportive community to these inner city people for whom their world had been turned upside down. And this community was not only logistically supportive, but it was also a social network, all while promising you eternal life. I mean, I totally get it. And I don't mean to take away from the spiritual aspect of this either. I'm not trying to undercut Jesus here. Undoubtedly, many people converted because they were deeply moved by Jesus' message, which has an obvious appeal. You know, the Christian lifestyle is a wonderful one. What I'm saying is that when you look at what Christianity is offering and what people needed, it was perfect. And so, when Christianity hit the cities of the Roman imperial core, it spread like wildfire, slowly accelerating throughout the 100s and 200s. And while the primary vector for spreading Christianity was the poor, as you can imagine, the other might surprise you because it was women. Women were the early adopters in most Roman families, and the sense that they usually converted first, then pressured their husbands into conversion later on. And we know this because Roman pagan sources wrote about it a lot. And it's interesting. You know, it's an interesting thing to chew on. I don't want to dwell on it, but it's interesting, at least to me, that a radical belief system based on empathy and pity saw differing levels of conversion success based on gender lines early on. But the point here is that the religion spread, and it spread fast, through the poor and through women. And while Rome did what it could to try and stop it, you know, the persecutions are famous, they literally threw Christians to the lions in the arena, Roman society just had too many chinks in the armor. There were just too many people that were ideologically available. Again, either that or Jesus' message was very compelling. Either way, the religion, which at any other time period may have just lingered around Mediterranean port cities as just yet another Eastern cult, spread fast. And then eventually in 313 AD, it was formally legalized by Constantine the Great with his famous Edict of Milan. And so, while Christians suffered to get to that point, you know, I'm not trying to paint the early Christian world as one that was just on cruise control. Christianity, as a religion, was cruising. It was spreading fast. It was lodging itself in the cities among the urban poor and women, and then slowly spreading outward from that. But then here come the Germans, who, for the most part, were pagan when they moved across the frontier throughout the 400s. Now, some tribes did convert before moving across, like the Visigoths and some of the Vandals, but the Franks, the Saxons, the Burgundians, the Sueves, if I recall, and all the others were pagan when they crossed. And so, for a brief moment in the 400s, at least from the perspective of the ruling elite, the religion map of Europe looked nuts, with many parts of Europe ruled by kings that, according to Danish archaeologist Lotte Hediager, shored up the legitimacy of their new regimes early on by claiming to be descendants of Odin, something that, for this brief moment in the 400s before these tribes began to convert, ironically made the cities of the Eastern Mediterranean the real backbone of Christianity. And this is something that many people don't know, that for a while, the places that would later get overrun by Muslim invasions, like Alexandria in modern-day Egypt, and Jerusalem and Damascus in modern-day Syria, as well as Antioch, Edessa, and Ephesus, all in modern-day Turkey, would be the backbone of Christianity for a while. And, so not to get off topic here, but I find it interesting that in the 400s, the real bulwark for Jesus was in places that only a few centuries later would all be lost to Arab conquests. But the point here, back to our story, while all the kings of these new German kingdoms would eventually convert, the key critical thing here is that to convince these kings and their nobility to convert, which is how they did it, by the way, focusing on the folks at the top, because in Germanic culture, the king was in charge of interacting with the gods, and so for the king to choose a new god for the tribe was not considered out of the ordinary. But to convince these kings and their nobility to convert, the point here is that the church made so many allowances and watered down what they sold Christianity as to such a degree in order to get them to get in the river and get baptized, that Christianity changed forever as a result. Like, this is like a forever, almost permanent thing. Because while the church worked very, very hard to fully bring the Germans into the fold of, Christian belief and ideology over time, they were never fully successful. And this meant that a ton of non-Christian elements of Germanic culture would remain as part of the medieval church. And this is why the topic is genuinely so fascinating, because the lingering effects of this influenced the entire trajectory of Western history. And the reason it went down like this, the reason Christianity had to water itself down to convert these conquering German tribes, was because German tribal society didn't have those chinks in the armor that Roman and Greek society had, meaning they weren't as ideologically available. Because remember, these tribes were super tightly knit. They were forged in the Darwinian pressure cooker that was the frontier zone. And this meant that the people in these tribes had a support network. They had community. They looked out for one another. They acted as one. Again, frontier Darwinian pressure cooker, that's what you get. And they didn't have tons of foreigners living among them with foreign cultures and foreign ways of thinking and foreign gods. Instead, these tightly knit tribes were unified by a shared culture and language, and so all of this means that they were more socially stable. So that's problem number one for Christianity. There's not as many chinks in the armor. Problem number two, which was way worse, complicating thing number two for Christianity here, was the fact that these people's belief system and worldview was completely alien. The Germans were like a thunderbolt straight from the Indo-European invasions in 3000 BC that we talked about in episode 2. Because unlike the Greek and Roman civilizations in the Mediterranean, which James Russell says had been thoroughly de-Indo-Europeanized by centuries of contact with non-Indo-European belief systems, German paganism developed across the millennia in the more geographically isolated region of Northern Europe and Scandinavia. And so, what this means, in very, very real terms, is that Jesus came face to face with a very, very old Indo-European warrior religion that was not only self-confident from toppling the greatest empire in the history of the West, but one that was alien to Christianity in almost every single way you can possibly imagine. I have pages of notes here filled with super crunchy contrasts between these two religions, things that you'll find genuinely fascinating because these belief systems are different in literally every way, from their value systems to their concept of what the universe was, to what they thought the soul was made up of. And then you have all the things in the Germanic/Norse belief system like magic and spirits and dwarves and elves and trolls. I mean, the list is huge, and these things are going to be so interesting to get to in the future. But the one thing I want to mention here now for our purposes, and it's a bit academic, but it's very important, so bear with me here, is that at their core, German paganism and Christianity are two profoundly different types of religions. Because on the German paganism side of things, which includes Norse paganism, by the way, this belief system is what academics call a world-accepting religion, meaning that it saw the world as inherently good, and that people should focus on the here and now, on your family, your life, on living up to the standards of your people, and to do these things not for heavenly reward, but because they are worth doing and they're simply part of your ethos here on earth. By contrast, Christianity is what theologians call a world-rejecting religion, because it sees this world as sinful and flawed and bad, and thus it advises people to spend their time trying to rise above it, to rise above the sinful traps of this world, to prepare themselves for a perfect afterlife. Now, does this mean that all Christians focus purely on the afterlife? Of course not. I live in the Bible Belt. I live in Georgia, and trust me, no one enjoys living it up more than the Southern bro. But if you ask Christians what matters more, if things here on earth matter more than things in the afterlife, the vast, vast majority of them will tell you, of course, what comes after is way more important. I literally hear this exact line of thinking from my father-in-law all the time. And so, this concept that the world and humanity and how humanity naturally is inherently bad to the degree that Jesus had to die for our sins, and that you should focus on rising above this sinful world, these were all completely alien concepts to the Germans. And remember, I can't emphasize this enough, we are just scratching the surface. Not only are these two fundamentally different religions, but the differences beyond this are extreme. I mean, we're going to get into this way more in the future, but in your mind, you just have to picture these as completely, completely different religions. And this meant that not only did the Germans not have the chinks in the armor, not only were they not ideologically available, but it also meant that the Christian missionaries were looking at something that was very, very old and very alien. And this meant that to convert these people to Jesus, the missionaries who were involved dropped basically all but the most important things when they walked into the courts of these German kings and started giving them their sales pitch. And this meant that when these kings and their nobility converted, they didn't know what they were signing up for. And this was purposeful because, again, the priests making the sales pitch for Jesus knew the Indo-European warrior religion Germans would never, ever have accepted it if they had fully understood what they were signing up for. So like any good car salesman, they lied by omission. Obviously, not directly, not changing the religion in huge obvious ways, but selectively telling a version of what Christianity was to get the Germans to get in the river and get baptized, with the plan being that once they converted them, they could start working on them to try and steer them back to a more conventionally Christian path. And don't believe me, here's what James Russell, one of the leading experts on this topic, writes in his book, The Germanization of Early Medieval Christianity. I quote, "It is quite possible that if doctrinal assent and ethical modification had constituted a prerequisite for baptism, those Celtic and Germanic leaders, whose own baptism often precipitated that of many of their kinfolk, might well have rejected Christianity, owing to its obvious ideological opposition to their Indo-European warrior code. Thus, the Christianization policies of accommodation and gradualism," which means slowly trying to steer the new converts towards more Christian teachings, "were effective in incorporating the Germanic peoples into the Roman Catholic Church. But at the same time, they led to a substantial Germanization of Western Christianity." End quote. So they kind of lied / accommodated, if you want to be generous, to the Germans to get them to get in the river to get baptized so they could earn the opportunity to begin working on them over time. That's how rough the outlook of the situation was. But look, I get it. No disrespect to Jesus here. I don't blame them at all. If you truly believe you are saving souls and working for the greater good, it makes total sense. You take the lesser of the two evils to get the big blonde Germans into the river in order to buy the opportunity to work on them as best you can over time. Because you don't really have any other option. I mean, what's the alternative? Let the Odin-worshipping pagans, who you can't militarily resist at all, rule over what was still a very, very young Christian community and perhaps see all the progress that you've made get rolled back once they understand what Christianity actually is? Again, I totally get it. But this choice to take the lesser of the two evils, to kind of lie by omission to get the big blonde German into the river, changed the entire future light cone trajectory of Christianity. And the reason why was that plan to just work on the Germans over time vastly underappreciated how stubborn German culture was. Very shocking for those of you who have met Germans in real life. But the point here is that the church vastly underestimated how resistant Germans would be to getting worked on, basically. And this was a problem not only at the top of the food chain with, the German kings like those of Clovis's Frankish dynasty, whose royal line never made any serious move to, do things like set up religious schools or push post-baptism religious instruction on the Franks until a dynasty later on that Charlemagne would come from. They took it a bit more seriously later on. But in the immediacy of their conversion, Clovis's Frankish dynasty didn't really care about pushing Christianity at all. So it was not only a problem at the top of the food chain, but it was also a problem at the bottom of the food chain, with the more rank and file of these conquering tribes. And to give you an anecdote for this, there's a book in the Vatican archives that perfectly illustrates this challenge. It's called the Indiculus Superstitionum et Paganiarum, and it's a 30-chapter book for Christian clergy on what they should watch out for among their German parishioners. Basically, what they should try and root out in their communities. This being what I mean when I say that the church worked on the Germans over time. And these 30 chapters cover things like offerings and rituals at grave sites, to special songs they sang at feasts, to animal sacrifices and ceremonies at sacred groves and shrines, to magic of all sorts. I mean, it's kind of hilarious because did you really convert someone if you need a 30-chapter hall monitor type manual on what to pester them about? And so, the point, again, as always, the point here is that this was far from a perfect conversion event where, the German dunks himself in the water and emerges a God-fearing, repentant man. You didn't get that. And while the church had some success in working out, what they considered to be the worst parts of the Germanic belief systems over time, like the human sacrifices, they got rid of that successfully. This conversion event's inefficiency, right? This imperfect conversion event became the roots of the medieval church. So in a very real sense, everything we're talking about here is upstream of the more sacred and mysterious and hierarchical and warlike medieval version of Christianity. Because again, while the church made some progress in working on the Germans, it was never fully successful in steering them away from many core elements of German culture. And while Christian listeners may not want to hear this, the fact that German culture and Christianity came together on pretty equal terms meant that for the first time in its history, Christianity gained something that it didn't really have before in its religious toolkit. And that was an extremely violent military arm that it could use, indirect. And as history will show, they were lucky to gain this at this time. The timing was very good for Jesus, so good that it honestly comes off as providence in the first place. Because anyone who knows anything about Christian history will tell you the early medieval church in Europe would rapidly get put under siege, basically from all four corners of the map. And to give you a few examples here, most of you will be familiar with the famous Battle of Tours, where the Franks turned back a Muslim army, or what may have just been a large raid into central France in 732 AD, at which point Islam had already overrun the eastern Mediterranean and North Africa as well as Spain. And then you have the Vikings in the north that we'll get into. Huge problem, obviously. And you also had invasions of a non-Christian people called the Magyars. basically Hungarians in the 800s and 900s, whose raids stretched across all of continental Western Europe. And so, if you are a Christian and you don't like what I'm saying, well, you walk through a time portal to early medieval Europe when Christianity was kind of under siege, and you'll probably hear a very different response of, thanks be to God that the Germans like to fight. And so, even though the Germans kept their focus on courage in battle and a hunger for glory and loyalty to one's lord when they got dunked in the river, basically keeping most of the warrior part of the Germanic Indo-European warrior religion when they went under the water, it ended up being just what Jesus needed at the time. And so, the church did the obvious logical thing with the situation by redirecting these inclinations in a productive way. You're under siege and you got a bunch of German Christians that like to fight. Good. As they say in Italy, molto bene. And so they pointed them in a productive direction. And so for the Germans in these northern kingdoms, that meant, work out your desire to fight by fighting the pagan Vikings or fighting the Magyars. And for the converted Visigoths in Spain, who had famously lost Toledo by treachery and thus were pushed back by Muslim expansion to the far north of the peninsula, it was go reconquer Spain. It began what we would eventually call the Reconquista. And all of this during the medieval period will eventually transform into go fight the heretics, go fight those we excommunicate, and go fight in the Holy Land against the Muslims there. And so in the Germans, Jesus gained a sword, hence the Twitter launch post gif, which I had fun making. And this, again, was a sword that Jesus badly needed. And so, in a very real sense, this is where the entire Christian knight/crusading phenomenon comes from. It's an expression of this melding of German culture and Christianity. And as always with big statements, don't believe me. Here are the words of the 19th century historian Karl Erdmann, who specialized in the origin of the crusading phenomenon. So again, if you're a Christian and you don't like what I'm saying, well, consider the words of someone far smarter than me. And here is what historian Karl Erdmann has to say on this topic in his work, The Origin of the Idea of the Crusade. I quote, "The entrance of the Germans into Christian history had created an entirely new situation. War was the lifestyle of the Germanic peoples, who increasingly formed the most important element in the church's constituency. The moral precepts that accompanied the Germans from their pagan past were completely oriented to war, focusing on heroism, famous deeds on part of the leader, loyalty on part of the followers, revenge for those killed, courage unto death, and contempt for a comfortable life at home. For them, war as such was a form of moral action, a higher type of life than peace. All of this stood in opposite pole from Christian morality, which is based on love and readiness for peace, and can discuss war only with reference to aims and duties. The acceptance of Christianity could not possibly cause the old Germanic mode of thinking to lose its power overnight. This mentality took centuries to overcome and still has some appeal today." He then gets into how the belief that Jesus helped them in battle led Clovis to lead his Franks into conversion, and the same thing with the Lombard king, kind of to underscore the point that this warlike nature was coming with them when they converted, because, if you believe Jesus helped you in battle, that kind of sets the tone of your initial conversion, right? I continue. "Nevertheless, the German mentality also exercised a positive influence upon the development of the ecclesiastical morality of war. When the church encountered pagan elements that it could not suppress, it tended to give them a Christian dimension, thereby assimilating them. This happened to the ethics of heroism. The whole crusading movement may justifiably be seen from this perspective. Christian knighthood cannot be otherwise understood." End quote. So Christian knights in the Crusades are just the Germanic expression of Christianity, basically. And to me, it's an interesting moment to step back and realize that the reason the medieval church was so different than the modern one, right? With the modern church's big emphasis on understanding and empathy, and its lack of willingness to more directly go to war with all the evils that plague modern society. That contrast largely stems from the fact that the medieval church was very Germanic. And so, if you're one of those people that has ever wished that the modern church would do more to combat things like the pornography industry or the gambling industry or OnlyFans or drug use or the decline in the family unit a bit more, if you wish the church was way more direct and actively confronting all the insanity, what you kind of miss is the more Germanized, Indo-European warrior ethos-infused medieval version of Christianity. Because if that came back to life, the church would be what Carl Erdmann is describing here. It would be in like full Warhammer Space Marine mode by the end of the year, glassing its enemies from orbit. But that church is gone. And in its place is one far more similar to the early Christian community in the Mediterranean, in the sense that it's become nicer and softer, and it has that therapeutic, almost universalist flavor to it. A mentality that often sees no borders and takes no sides and respects everyone, right? Let me tell you, that version of Christianity didn't turn back the Muslims in 732 at Tours, nor did it climb scaling ladders at Jerusalem in 1099. And so, if you are a young Christian guy listening to this is kind of why you get the Christ is King type guys in the same church pew and Bible study as the radical love, tie-dye, God is love, love is God type guys. Those two dudes look at each other like the other one is crazy, but remember, it's the same religion, it's the same God, it's the same holy book. One is just unknowingly channeling that Germanic, space marine version of Christianity, while the other has an ethos that is far more rooted in the early church. And if I'm speaking as something you've thought of or felt at some point in your life, if I'm striking a tone with you here, that's because, like Carl Erdmann just told us, those old school Germanic values still linger in Northern Europeans and therefore, by extension, much of American culture today. In other words, they live on in you, depending on your background. But these values are quiet. They're subtle. No one is aware of them because you've never heard it discussed before in a classroom or a lecture hall. Joe Rogan isn't going to talk about it on his podcast because it's a very niche academic topic, and so it's not going to make its way into popular discourse, but it's very real. And if you want an interesting proof point of all this, that Carl Erdmann is right and that, this very, very old Germanic ethos hasn't fully gone away, a proof point that is almost certainly real in your life on a personal level is to think about how The Lord of the Rings strikes such a tone with Northern European and American listeners in particular. Because think about that. Why is that? There's something about The Lord of the Rings that is deeply appealing to men. And it's not because men are all super into the fantasy genre. Most guys I know who have read the books when they were young aren't even into fantasy. It's not most people's thing, but Lord of the Rings is different. It's everyone's favorite. And while that is because it's so well written and the movies were so well done, it's also because it strikes a very, very deep tone with men in the West. And the reason why is because Tolkien, in perfect form, brought together the two medieval ingredients we're talking about here, that of Christian values and this Germanic warrior ethos, which is why the books and the movies feel like home in a way. And I mean that, seriously. Something about them feels fundamentally right on some level. All of you know this. All of you have felt this. You know exactly what I mean. Because while the books are not overtly religious, Jesus isn't in the books. Christian values are still everywhere. You have mercy, pity, providence, the ring as a kind of corrupting sin. You have Aragorn as a self-sacrificing, Christ-like king figure. You have the belief that good will ultimately prevail over evil. And again, don't believe me, Tolkien himself said that the books are fundamentally religious. And keep in mind, Tolkien was a devout Catholic. But at the same time, the story's soul is deeply Germanic. And this is something that most people don't know. that Tolkien was an Old English linguist. He translated the German hero story Beowulf, and early on in his career, he wanted to make a mythology for England that connected the legendary Anglo-Saxon and Norse stories. That was one of his goals he had when he was young. And that means that he understood the German warrior ethos more than anyone, because he could read it in its original language. And so he could put himself into the mind of these early Germanic warriors more than almost anyone else on earth possibly could, because that's what you get when you're a linguist. You understand the stories that you're translating. You understand the worldview and the nuance and the societies that these stories take place in, because that deep understanding is part of the job. You have to know those things to translate well. And if any of you read his translation of Beowulf, which I highly encourage you to do, by the way, it's a very quick read and it's awesome. I swear to you that it'll put the entire Lord of the Rings series in a new light. It'll be like reading the books again. Because while most people know that the books are full of Christian values, again, people don't realize just how deeply Germanic they are. It's in the aesthetic, the feeling, the northern courage, all the doomed last stands against impossible odds, every single battle literally being the good guys willingly marching out to their deaths, choosing to fight doomed battle after doomed battle out of loyalty to their lord and love of one's people. Literally the battle cry of Rohan was chanting death. In the book, Theoden says, I quote, "Death take us all, ride to ruin and the world's ending." Folks, those are not universal cultural attitudes. Not every civilization since the dawn of time has had that charge of Rohan, ride out with me at Helm's Deep kind of ethos. And while Germanic culture doesn't have a monopoly on bravery, that's not what I'm saying here. This attitude, that ethos, is extremely Germanic. And then you have the names and the clothing and the buildings of Rohan, which are all straight from stories like Beowulf and Siegfried and the old German battle sagas. Even the name Middle-earth is Germanic/Norse. That was their name for Earth, Midgard, basically meaning Middle-earth. And the term Ringlord is pulled straight out of Beowulf. And part of the reason he did this, the reason Tolkien spent 17 years of his life on this, was laid out in a letter he wrote to his son, Michael, writing that he hated that Adolf Hitler had taken the noble Germanic tradition and morphed it into an ideology of racial supremacy, something we talked about in episode 2, if you recall. And so, in a very real sense, Lord of the Rings is Tolkien's perfect restoration of the Germanic ethos in its true positive form. And we're so lucky he did this. Humanity is so lucky he did this, because he did it perfectly. And he brought the Germanic ethos back to life as if he was applying like a defibrillator to a German warrior from the early medieval period 1400 plus years ago. Literally shocking this ethos back to life out of the ground and putting it on pages for all of us to read. And this, combined with the Christian ethos, Tolkien's melding of Jesus and Germanic, is why the story feels like home. It's why it resonates so deeply with men in the West. It's why it clicks and feels fundamentally right on some level. Because none of that is gone. It's just quiet, lurking under the surface. And so, giant segues into Lord of the Rings aside, and to zoom back into space with me real quick, all of these things we've talked about in this episode put these conquering tribes on a very, very different trajectory than the tribes that stayed back in the Germanic interior of northern Germany and Scandinavia. That's why we got into all this, to get into the very, very different path that these tribes walked as they conquered the Roman Empire, where they changed for all the reasons that we've discussed. Because while it took the church a long, long time to get partially successful with the Germans did change. And that, with getting rich and living in the ruins of the greatest empire Europe had ever seen, and rubbing shoulders with the remnants of the Roman elite, and being influenced a bit by classical culture, changed them. Again, it put them on a different path than the tribes in the far north, who didn't engage in these conquests and who kept their Indo-European warrior religion and maintained their traditional ways of life and social organization, and who weren't exposed to classical thought and civilization. But the tribes in the far north had their own path to walk. And that story that we'll get into next time is so wild, it's so genuinely dark, and I mean this very sincerely, that I have literally begun losing sleep as I've begun ramping up for it. Because the story is disturbing on like a fundamental level. Because not only is it dark, but it's a story that almost none of you have heard of. Because humanity only recently found out about the event that we're going to get into next. But before you go, big news, good news, big news. I've launched a podcast store, and it's awesome. I've come up with some minimalistic designs that are actually cool and not just, boomer graphic tee nonsense. I've got 2 t-shirts, I've got a hoodie and a quarter zip, and it's all either pre-shrunk cotton or mostly cotton blends. Always a good thing, especially for us guys, to reduce the polyester, bad for the testosterone levels. And plus, it's a great way to support the show. I put a titanic amount of time and soul energy into this, and so any support you can give me is very much appreciated. The link to the store is on the launch post for this episode in the highlights section of my Twitter profile, but if you can't find it, just DM me on Twitter and I'll send it right to you. Second thing, very important, I have a request. And the request is that because I put content before everything here, rather than trying to play the Twitter game, to get this podcast out there, your support is huge in helping me get this going. And the biggest thing you can help me do to get this show rolling is to give the show a solid rating on whatever app that you're on, and then give the launch post a good quote, retweet, endorsement on Twitter to get the word out. And lastly, if you can hit the notifications button on my profile for posts, not comments. I screw around on Twitter a lot, just posts, because I only post episodes. That would be awesome, because it means that when I launch the next episode on Twitter, you can get instantly notified and also help me launch each new episode into the stratosphere, so to say. And so that said, get pumped. The next 2 episodes, which I'm calling Out of the Frying Pan Into the Fire, is going to be genuinely so crazy. It's going to be so dark, I swear. It'll be the most horrifying story you've never heard of, and I'm super pumped to get into it. Until next time, though, I hope you enjoyed the show, and thank you again for tuning into the Northway Podcast.